My grandpa was born in the last years of the 19th century and spent his entire life living in rural Idaho as a farmer and rancher. He had tons of old cowboy stories he would tell us grandkids. Most of them were funny, some were cautionary, but a few were downright creepy. When my grandpa was 6 years old, he, along with his older brother and a gang of kids from nearby farms, decided to go ice skating for the day. At that time, my great-grandpa was working as a ranch hand, and the family lived near Chesterfield, Idaho, now mostly a ghost town. It was a bright and sunny January day in 1902, and though the temperature was low, the sun kept things somewhat warm. They had hitched sleighs to their horses and headed down to the Portneuf River to ice skate. There were 8 kids altogether, and they were excited to show off their new skates they'd received from Christmas. Along with my grandpa and his brother, there were 3 Robinson kids, Tommy Bayer and the Gooch twins. The best spot to skate was next door to the Gooch's ranch. The river there was broad and shallow, so the ice tended to be thicker, and if they did fall through, they would just get their legs wet. The kids spent a few hours ice skating, when a loud scream came from a willow bush on the riverbank opposite them. The kids could only watch as what they described as a giant man covered head to toe in thick black fur came lumbering out of the bushes. It was carrying a large tree branch and was screaming in rage at the kids. They fled towards the sleds, trying to scramble up the riverbank in their skates. My grandpa, being the youngest, was at the back of the rush. He couldn't get a good foothold because of the skates and fell towards the ice. The giant was crossing the river towards them, screaming and swinging his branch. My grandpa was sure the creature was going to eat him. As my grandpa tells it, Lady Luck smiled down on me that day by the river, because as the giant was midway across the river, the ice gave way, and it submerged only to its shins, but it was slowed down considerably as it tried to get back on top of the ice. This gave my grandpa's brother enough time to jump down and cut the laces off my grandpa's skates. They left the skates and dashed up the riverbank and jumped onto the sleigh. As they looked back, the giant man was cresting the riverbank. To their relief, it didn't chase the sleighs. It just stood there hollering at the kids and swinging his tree branch menacingly. The kids were able to make it back to the Gooch ranch, where they told their encounter to John Gooch, the twins' grandfather. Word spread quickly in the tiny farming community, and soon a posse was formed to hunt down the beast. Where the kids had been skating, they found footprints almost 2 feet in length. My grandpa's skates were found near the tracks. They had both been bent, like half a horseshoe. The tracks headed west into the nearby mountains. The posse followed them as far as they could go, but deep snow prevented them from traveling any further. The creature was never sighted in the area again. The story captivated the small community, and soon word traveled across the country of the Idaho Wild Man. It was even published in a newspaper article which described the event at the time. That spring, my great-grandpa decided to buy a little ranch in the Little Lost River Valley further north in Idaho. My grandpa had many other weird and creepy backwoods stories, but he always said this encounter frightened him the most. He was positive he would have been killed if the giant hadn't broken through the ice, and his brother had not had the chance to cut his laces. The state of New York is filled with paranormal activity. From Alcatraz Island to the Amityville Horror House, the Fox Sisters' home, and the Landmark Theatre. But in my small town, just outside of Syracuse, we have Whiskey Hollow Road. This incredibly narrow road has no lights and stretches for 5 miles. On one side of your vehicle is a seemingly endless tall hill covered in trees, and on the other side is a 30-foot drop into a ravine. So basically, if you have to make a 3-point turn on the street, You better be a professional stunt driver. The story goes like this. Back in the 50s, a married couple lived in a small shack on the end of the road. They were a seemingly normal couple. Through some speculated domestic issues and possibly infidelity, one day the husband came home to his wife's body collapsed on the floor in their home covered in blood and his shotgun by her side. The pain was too much, and not long after she was buried, the man took a rope to the opposite end of the street and let himself hang from the tree there. No matter what side you enter or exit the street, you're greeted by suicide. Through the years, there have been a few bodies discovered in the ravine, both with blunt trauma wounds and some seemingly clean, as if they just dropped dead and rolled down the hill to rest. In the middle of the road, about 2 miles in, is a small cave, which has long been speculated to be a site of some local ritualistic ceremonies, which could easily be dismissed, if not for the occasional bloody rag or other ominous item found inside. My story begins in 2010. I was in my junior year of high school, and my mother, a horror buff herself, was looking up some spooky places for a creepy road trip she wanted to take. She stumbled upon the Whiskey Hollow Road lore, and that night, my mother, my brother, a cousin, an aunt and I hopped into the minivan and drove the 15 minutes to the haunted street. I admit, I scoffed a little, being too cool for everything, punk kid, but I was intrigued enough to come, and I admit, when the van rolled up that tiny dirt road, my mood changed. I felt an immediate shift in energy as my mum crept the van into the entrance of the road. And here is where I need to stress just how dark this road is at night. Imagine the darkest place you've been, and go about 10 times darker than that. Headlights are barely useful, and honestly, you can see about 2 feet in front of your vehicle, even with your high beams on. Just before we rolled in, a pickup truck whipped around us and flew down the road, and I mean flew. He had to have been going at least 60 on the street, and realistically going at 20 would be risky. I fully expected to see his truck flip over in the ravine as we entered. The road is pitch black and shockingly quiet. You know when you used to play hide and seek and would hide in the closet or another small space, and you could hear your heart beating and your lungs making air for you? Yeah, it was that quiet. We shined flashlights through the trees as we passed, and we got our glimpse of the cave in real life. There's some dark energy in there, man. All in all, the drive was not terrifying. We made it to the end of the road, and just as we were about to clear the trees, a burst of light shot across our eyes. We squinted to see the pickup truck sitting at the end of the street facing us, as if it was waiting to see if we would make it out. We pulled out on the regular road, and this guy takes off down Whiskey Hollow again. To this day, I don't know how he did it. The next day, my mother was disappointed that nothing spooky happened and decided we head out in the daytime to see what the road looked like, all lit up. We rolled into the entrance, and yes, it was a lot less unsettling. But then again, isn't everything less scary when the lights are on? The silence was still there too, which shocked me a little bit. Not a bird or an owl, and I realized I never once saw any animal in those woods, which for upstate New York is quite odd. Usually in dense wood, you see a chipmunk or even a garden snake, but nothing. Mum decided to pull up to the cave, and we all got out to inspect it in the daylight. It wasn't as deep as we had imagined it would be, but there were some disturbing items inside. A small baby blanket with a suspicious stain, and a rattle with some colourful beads inside of it, some alcohol cans, and an old lighter. When I saw the blanket, I felt a knot in my stomach. My mum brushed it off, and we went on with the rest of our day. Fast forward to the senior year of high school. I was hanging out a lot with a cousin who was not only a bad influence, but didn't give me half a thought to anything paranormal. I, however, was getting into full baby witch mode this year. We were hanging out with a mutual friend one night and were bored. My cousin Marie says she wants to do something creepy. Our friend Kelly said she'd heard of a haunted road somewhere. I butt right in and give them the whole story of Whiskey Hollow, and we're off. The whole ride we're listening to music and having typical teenage fun. But the minutes we approached the cross street, it was like my body could sense the dark energy again. I was in the back seat and was playing it cool as we pulled up to the beginning of the road. But I felt the energy shift hard. It was sunset hour, so we had some light, but I knew our time was limited. We rolled through, and I reiterate the story again as we passed the trees. Marie is mocking everything and saying BS, but Kelly is listening as we approach the cave. She excitedly points at it, and we stop the car. As we approach the cave, the road is silent as usual, and our feet crunched the leaves, and it seemed to echo in the vast space. Marie walks straight into the cave. Like the horror movie cliché, she kicks the dirt, talking crap, just being your standard jerk. I tell her to chill, as she's being disrespectful to anyone who may have passed away in the area, which just fuels her, and she carries on being a dick. Kelly and I are just standing there watching her, and I open my mouth to ask her to stop. But then, without anyone touching us, both mine and Kelly's knees buckle, as if someone hit the back of our legs, and we fall into the grass. We whip around, terrified, fully expecting to see a deranged individual, but there was no one. Marie laughs at us for falling, and we insist that something pushed us, and we rub the grime from our jeans. Marie calls BS and heads back to the car. As she walks down the hill, Kelly and I try to figure out what the hell just happened and examine the rock, which was completely flat, so it's not like gravity took us down or we lost our footing. "Oh my god," Marie screams from the car. We race towards the vehicle and ask what happens. She fumbles for words, telling us to get in now. She says that when she opened the door, a bright white light dashed across the front of the car. It was too solid to be smoke, but not fully shaped to be a figure. I wonder for a split second if she was messing with us, but her face was pale and colourless. Marie had never looked like this. The genuine worry on her face was palpable. She hopped into the front seat, and I slid into the back. Marie started the car, and we pulled away. I couldn't help but give one last look to the cave. That's when I saw something. There was a figure crouched down at the top of the cave. It looked slender, was completely dark, like the leather man from American Horror Story, but very skinny. I thought I was crazy. And just as it started to stand, Kelly let out a blood-curdling scream from the seat. "Something's in the cave!" Marie floored the gas pedal, and we whipped it down the street. I was trying to come to terms with the fact that at least two of us saw an entity on that cave, and that it couldn't have been an actual person. There was no way. We would have seen someone at the top of the cave when we first approached. This wasn't a person. It was a thing. Marie shouted her mother's address into the car's GPS, and it began routing us away from the haunted road. Its navigation voice would chime in directions, and Marie turned and twisted as we tried to explain the figure we saw. The GPS then said, "Turned right." Marie was so frazzled from her own experience, and was avidly listening to ours, that she just turned without thinking. And when we looked out the window again, we were back at the top of Whiskey Hollow Road. The GPS brought us back again to the top of the road. We couldn't turn around. We had to drive down it again. "What's wrong with you?" Marie was glaring at me from the front seat. "What? Why are you acting like that?" I had no idea what she was talking about. Then I looked out the window and saw that we were parked at a pizza place in Marie's hometown. How did we get here? Marie then explained to me that for the entire ride back, I was silently giving her a death stare through the rearview mirror and wouldn't speak when she spoke to me. I would only smirk, and apparently on the highway I tried to open the door, fumbling with the lock and handle, but she had child lock on. I remembered none of it. From my point of view, we turned down Whiskey Hollow Road for the second time, and then I was sitting in a parking lot. I've thought for years about that occurrence, what it was all about, and the only thing I can think of is that when something noticed me when I first visited the place with my mother, and then when I returned with my cousin and friend, it recognized and latched onto me. Possibly. I refused to return to that place, and wonder if the entity that got inside me, the one that stood on top of the cave, was the same thing that drove the couple in the 50s to end their lives on either side of this scary road. Romania is a country where people might get kidnapped, murdered, and disappear. My parents were legitimately afraid for me and were against the idea. I had to lie and tell them that we would stay in a hotel near Koscia National Park so they would get off my back. Obviously, that's not what we did. Long story short, we had to travel from Bucharest to this park, which is around 200 kilometers or 2 hours by train. We get our immense backpacks, everything we need, and went on our way. Nothing specifically happened on the train, except for the fact that it was overly crowded, with the exception of our train compartment being vacant, which is extremely rare for a Romanian train. I get excited thinking that we have the whole compartment to ourselves. As I said, it's a very rare thing to happen, and of course, after 10 to 20 minutes, it gets occupied by a man entering our compartment, with a beautiful German Shepherd. I love all kinds of animals, cats and dogs in particular, and I usually find my way around all animals, even if those don't like people. Not this dog. This dog was otherworldly. He looked so cute, like a stuffed animal. He would listen to his owner's every single command. I was impressed. It was obvious. I start asking the man about his dog, and that would be a long and awkward trip to have in complete silence if I was just staring at it. The man was exactly like his dog, except the commands he would give his dog, no other contribution to the conversation. He told me the dog's name, which is Ucigashul, which in Romanian means the killer. It's a very weird name to give to a dog. For this particular example, we would use the English word as it doesn't really translate into Romanian for context, but I thought each to their own. I asked him why such a scary and unusual name. He replied bluntly, "This dog is trained to kill. It's the only thing he likes, and he's very good at it." Okay then. Now I personally consider that the dog will grow up to have similar personalities to their owner, and most of the time, I would judge the people with dogs on how the animals react to the world and their owner. And let me tell you guys, these two did not give off good vibes in return. I brushed everything over, thinking to myself that maybe this guy is training his dog to hunt in the woods. Then I started thinking which woods are legal to hunt in our country. While I was thinking that, the guy out of nowhere asks if we're traveling to Koscia National Park. This was surprisingly accurate, considering that the only time we mentioned this place was in the train station long before we found our seats, and far before we met this man. I thought it was weird, but again, in my country, people who travel in that direction will try and make small talk and guess where you're going. Of course, you can't just lie to keep you safe of your destination, or be honest. I chose to be honest, and I'm judging myself for that. Never be honest with strangers, or honest at all, after you read this story. We confirmed that that's where we were going, and asked what else there was to see around, since he started talking about the area, and, well, considering that we knew nothing about the place, we took it all in. He told us about the woods, the vegetation, the animals we encountered, told us about a beautiful monastery right at the bottom of the mountain that we needed to climb, and advised us to visit the Lotry Shore, a waterfall, and explore the caves behind it, and try and find the local restaurant. When the guy started talking about the wilderness and nature, his eyes glowed as if he was experiencing a pleasant memory, but he also grabbed his dog's collar from the neck, squeezing it tightly. The collar made a loud click sound. What surprised me was that the dog didn't move, didn't whimper, didn't twitch, just like a stuffed animal. We reached our destination, said goodbye, and the man waves us off, and we faced against him to go on our way. I turned right back around because I wanted to ask where exactly the restaurant was. But the man, nor dog, were no longer there. Not just that, his luggage was gone. That creeped me out a bit, but who cares? We were too thrilled for our first camping experience. We began walking with our backpacks on, each at least 10 kilos, and we reached a tunnel that had been dug into the mountain. It looked amazing, exactly like those horror movie tunnels which, if travelled during the night, would make your hair stand on end. Lucky for me it was daytime. It wasn't a particularly long tunnel, we could see the end the whole time, but when we got to the middle, we hear a whimper in the distance. It sounded like a dog crying in desperation for its life. We stop. My boyfriend looks at me with a, "Oh no, you're not going to take that dog with us" kind of face and tries to convince me to take a different route. We don't. I hear the dog. I go right toward the sound, and in the middle of the road I see a chubby puppy with lots of white and brown circles on his butt, crying so hard, laying on the cement looking really hurt as if hit by a car. I freeze and think to myself, our trip is over. I have to save this dog. We call for him. He looks at us, pointy ears up, gets up like a doofus and starts running desperately to us. He was alone and afraid. We called him Rudolph, and he is now our camping buddy. Like 1 kilometer further, we find another puppy, probably his sister, which we dragged from a nearby river. Someone threw her into the river to kill her. All wet, cold and hungry, we of course take her too. So here we are, with 10 kilos on our backs and 2 puppies at our chest, my boyfriend with a map, and trying to find a spot to camp at for the first night. We passed by the monastery the man on the train mentioned to us, but because we had puppies we couldn't enter the building, the priests wouldn't allow it, so we walked around the property through the gardens until we reached the base of the mountain we had to climb. I'd like to mention that these puppies were 2 tiny little brats, because the second you put them down and forced them to walk on their own, they would slam their butts on the ground and cry. What a drama. We walk and walk until we decide to stop, because it was getting late, and it was starting to get cold. We found a spot next to a small landmark type of cottage in the middle of the woods. We call it Troyanica. It's like a scouting post, but for the church, where they place religious icons or a Bible and stuff like that, in order to bring good energy to the area. It belongs to the church. It wasn't like a house. It was basically a roof with 4 small walls and an opening, not a door, that you could go into, like to hide from the rain. There was an icon inside and a Bible with pages ripped from it. Curiously, I opened the Bible and was really annoyed to see that people would write down their names, like couples do on trees. But on this particular page, the words, "I will find you," stuck out written in red ink. I thought to myself that it was probably someone who just wanted to scare travelers with silly messages. I put the book back and gave it no second thought. We put up the tent, make a quick fire, unpack, make food and eat. We feed the puppies, which are now cuddled up in our tent, and finally darkness starts to rise all around us. My boyfriend kept waking up every hour because he wanted to keep the fire alive. Now it's around midnight. We're in the tent, cuddled and warm. The puppies wake up and start to cry. I get up and unzip the tent and put them out to pee. They do it and I put them back in. They cry some more, and the smallest one begins to shiver. At the same time I hear grunting from behind the tent. My boyfriend is up too. The fire is fading, and the moment he unzips the tent and steps out, the sounds disappear into the woods. It sounded like a snake slithering through the fallen leaves on the ground, but with unimaginable speed. I ask him, was that a snake? He says, up to this day, that he cannot explain what he saw, that it was a slithery figure with feet that made a snort-like sound when the light hit it. The puppies calmed back down, and whatever it was made its way back into the woods. We tried to go back to sleep after we reignite the fire. It's 3 a.m. this time, and we try to wake up the puppies being fussy again. The fire is nearly dead. We clearly have no idea to put up a sustaining fire, we think to ourselves. My boyfriend gets up to search for firewood, and I get out too. I stare into the darkness, and I swear to God I hear whispers coming from behind the trees. I look up at the sky, and considering it's 3 a.m., and hearing birds very loudly fluttering their wings. Now, I'm no expert in birds, but aren't they usually asleep around this time? These weren't. They were very active, very vocal, and very frustrated. I look at the fire and follow the red sparks popping out of the sky, and became fascinated with something. The sparks don't seem to die. It goes on, changing color from hellish red to green. This was very out of the ordinary for me, because it created an illusion hard to explain. It looked as if the fire sparks were going into the woods, creating a track, probably for me to follow. I kept looking after each spark to see where it burnt out, but none of them did. At that moment I began to get goosebumps on my skin, the birds being agitated, the mysterious lights pointing us to go deeper into the woods, and all the trees around us had eyes in them, like the trunks had a distinguished shape that looked like eyes. I know this is nothing paranormal, since someone explained that these shapes form when a branch is ripped from the root, and that's the shape that's left after. But there were so many. It was like I had hundreds of eyes looking at me. As I inspected my surroundings, I heard movement in one of the bushes in front of our tent, about 10 meters away from us. Obviously I stand my ground, but don't go near it. Suddenly a dark, bent-over silhouette comes out of it, half inside, half outside the bush, and stares at us. I call my boyfriend and we're both like, what the hell is that? A bear? A wolf? A pig? The creature shakes its head the same way a dog does after a bath, and I hear a distinguished click like a dog collar. At this time my boyfriend manages to light up the fire really big, which scares the animal, and it runs back into the woods, through the bush which it initially came out of. That calms us down, but not enough to ever close our eyes during that night again. Retreating back into the tent, my boyfriend falls asleep. The puppies are sound asleep, but not me. I keep the zipper on the tent opened a little, just enough to have my eyes peeking through to the bush. I think I spent a solid hour staring and falling asleep to the sight of that bush, when all of a sudden I hear a noise coming from that direction, and I immediately wake up my boyfriend, who is now peeking through a hole in complete darkness with me. What we see next still haunts my dreams. From that exact bush we see a human head popping out and looking towards our tent. Note that our peeping hole was small enough to not making look like you were being watched from inside the tent. This head is slowly coming out of the bush, skin so white I thought it was a ghost. After that, the shoulders, a full torso, and a leg. Bit by bit, an entire man, completely naked, emerges from the bush, lit by both the moon and our fire. What he did next was excruciatingly scary for me. He comes so close to our tent and begins to remove branches and rocks from our fire, basically extinguishing it by dismantling it. This all happens 2 to 3 meters from our tent. I look at the man with horror, because I recognize him, and now the clink I heard earlier from the animal is explained. It's the same man from the train with his dog too. I don't know if he followed us, I don't know if he just went the same route as us and found us and decided to stalk us, but this guy was there since midnight at least, because our fire would be dead every 2 to 3 hours, and we would be woken up by the sound of branches being cracked and rocks being moved, which we initially explained away as animals crossing the path. After he successfully managed to put out the fire, he slowly crept back into the same bush, submerging into it bit by bit, until only his head would be out, with a disfigured-looking mouth, looking like a moaning ghost. You try going to sleep after that. We didn't know what to do, so we just got back out, reignited the fire, lit ourselves some torches, and stayed near the campfire until the first rays of sun came out. I admit I did fall asleep while sitting next to the fire, and so did my boyfriend, but any sound would wake us up the moment we heard it. I was too afraid to go near that distanced bush. I did not need answers or explanations. I just wanted daylight and to get the hell out of there. And we did. We packed our stuff and got the hell out. We planned a 4-day camping trip, and this experience made us give up on the first night. It was a risk we did not intend to take. If that guy followed us or it was just a coincidence, it was enough to ruin all of it. As a conclusion to my story and advice to any first-time campers out there, never tell anyone your location or even areas remotely close to your destination to a stranger. You don't know where their minds take them. and what they may end up doing. Always stay safe, always be aware of your surroundings, and any changes that come to you under the form of sound, movement, or temperature, and protect yourselves. The summer of 2008 was a rough time to graduate from college. I had spent 4 years getting a degree, only to find the job market had all but dried up. As bummed out as I was about being unemployed for the foreseeable future, I found a deep appreciation for backcountry camping and hiking that summer. Growing up in the Rocky Mountains and graduating from a college in western Montana, I was not a stranger to hiking or camping, but that summer it became an escape to the point of an obsession. Going on daily hikes and camping beneath the stars really helped my mental health, while I was worried about my life's purpose and my future. It was June, and unseasonably cold, wet and cloudy. The daytime heights barely touched 50 degrees, and at night it dropped below freezing. Despite the weather, I had planned to hike around the Anaconda Range that week, and I wasn't going to let it deter me. My plans for the week, funnily enough, were to hike from Storm Lake, over Storm Lake Pass, and down to Upper Seymour Lake. Storm Lake, actually an alpine reservoir, is a challenge to get to, and requires a 4x4 pickup and some skilled driving. The road is a narrow 2-track, winding its way through thick pine forests, and was slick with rain. But I made it to the top with little heartburn. I set up camp on the north side of the lake and decided to do some fishing. The fishing was miserable. It was cold and nothing was biting. But the best thing about bad fishing is that my thoughts were free to wander while I sat on the shore. The rain was a constant light drizzle and created a natural white noise. Time passed, and my daydreams were cut short as a low rumble up from the canyon overtook the sounds of the rain. The rumbling was not unlike that of a distant diesel engine. There were no roads that go beyond where I was camped. No machinery or vehicles could be up that canyon. Maybe it's a plane, I thought, looking up into the rain and clouds. But the sound wasn't getting any closer or further away, and the sound was not above me. It came from beyond the lake and up into the canyon. The sound was stationary and constant. This was most certainly not a plane, or a truck, or a bulldozer. All of this wasn't outright scary, but nonetheless, my hair stood on end while I sat there listening. After 20 minutes, the rumbling faded away, and I was left again with only the sound of raindrops. Soon enough, I caught a decent-sized trout, cleaned it, and headed back to the camp to get ready for dinner. The fish cooked up fine, but to be honest, I hate trouts. It's edible, but sure enough, totally unappetizing. They taste like mud. I ate as much as I could and tossed the rest back into the lake, building up my fire for the night. I sat back to enjoy the evening with a bit of whiskey. Night came fast. The mountain ridges put the sun to bed early, and the rain clouds obscured the starlight. It was dark, really dark. The sound of a crackling warm fire and the rain bouncing off my tent were a great comfort to lull me to sleep. I reminded myself that I needed to build up the fire before bed. I walked over to my pile of scavenged firewood and grabbed an armful. Being away from the fire's crackling, I could pick up that all too familiar rumbling rising in the background. It was growing louder than before, and closer. I may have had a few too many pulls of whiskey and was tired and grouchy. The noise was ruining my whole camping trip and my buzz. Frustrated, I yelled into the darkness of night, "Hey, shut up!" Like a switch being flipped, the rumbling stopped, and so did the rain. My heart skipped a beat. I realized this was not a complete coincidence. Something intelligent was out there. Something sentient, observing me and responding to my screams, and I wasn't getting the most positive vibes from it. I threw all the logs on the fire and retreated back to my tent, more on edge than I have ever been, listening to the fire crackling, to my rapid breathing, and beyond that to the silence of the darkness. Before this moment I had felt alone but safe. Now, I felt alone and vulnerable. Beyond where the light faded, I felt that there were a million eyes in the dark watching me. My paranoia began to subside when the rain suddenly started again. Not a drizzle, but a downpour. I was glad I had built up the fire, or it would have been snuffed out for sure. My tent was being pushed down by the force of the storm. I thought about bailing to the truck, but I knew I'd be soaked to the bone in an instant. Risking injury or death over getting wet is the kind of logic only whiskey can produce. I could feel the rainwater pooling and moving under my tent. The storm wasn't letting up. The urge to get in the pickup and drive away was ever more tantalizing. I could get my stuff tomorrow in the daylight and spend a few nights in town. But I'd had a bit too much to drink. Driving, especially on that slick, muddy, 2-track road, would have been a death sentence. But I still needed a safer place to sleep than a wimpy tent. Grabbing what I could, I ripped open the tent flaps and ran for the truck. I was soaking wet by the time I settled into the driver's seat and locked the doors, turning the heat on full blast. I hoped that it would dry me out. It was going to be a miserable night, though. I reclined in my chair and tried to calm my thoughts with deep breaths. The rain wasn't letting up. I was warm from the heater, and I was riding the crest of a good whiskey buzz. The fire was still raging despite the rain, and kept the campsite well lit. I remember the truck's clock reading 1:06 a.m. I blinked. It was only a moment later, but when I opened my eyes, the rain had stopped. It was foggy and quiet. The once raging campfire was now embers, and there was morning twilight to the east. The truck's clock now read 5:45 a.m. It was morning. That couldn't be right. Almost 5 hours gone in the blink of an eye. I must have passed out. My head was killing me. I didn't feel like I had drunk that much to justify that kind of hangover. I turned off the truck and stepped out to survey the night's damage. My tent was completely flattened. The tent poles were shattered to pieces and everything was soaking wet. Smothering the remains of the fire, I dragged all the junk to the pickup and tossed it in the bed. My hike over the pass wasn't happening today. That was for sure. It was around 6:30 a.m. before I finished picking up camp. As I climbed into the cab of my truck, I heard the rumbling again through the morning fog. I drove out of there as fast as I could down that muddy bobsled track of a road, not once looking in the rearview mirror. I have never been back to Storm Lake, and I probably never will. Both me and my buddy saw this thing that was pure white and around 7 feet tall and just walked down an old trail that had junk all around it. A few years later, I was walking home from my buddy's house, which was right next to the sledding hill that has a forest on both sides, and another white figure just casually walks up it as soon as I round the corner of my friend's house. For perspective, my friend's front door faces the main street just after a crossroads, and on the left side is the sled hill that I had to go to get to my house. I looked at it for a second, then turned around and hid. Not even 2 seconds later and it was gone, and I would have been the only one to see it leave, but I didn't. I was home on the computer in the middle of the 2000s in New Zealand, and then I looked out the window and saw a second sun. Like, there was the sun, and there was another one, a bit far away, but in the same place. I thought maybe I was not mentally okay and I was just seeing things, so I called my mum and siblings to check, and they all saw it. My mum is religious, so she thought it was the second coming of Christ and got all excited. I did not believe, so I was like, oh damn, are we gonna die? Is it a meteor, a bomb? The second sun started to get larger and change colours. It went all the colours of the rainbow and then disappeared. To this day I don't know what it was. My memory is hazy now, but I did remember the date for years and searched it incessantly. We lived in a rural town, so it wasn't on the news. The only thing I ever found that may have been slightly relevant was that Russia were doing nuclear tests at the time. But Russia is very far away from New Zealand. I wish I could remember more now. It would have been around 2006 or 7. May have been just a meteor burning up in the atmosphere. but damn it, it was the strangest thing I ever did see. It was dark, a mile or so from the river, lots of woods. We were driving, no cars coming or anything. Night, like after 10, and not near a town. Right on the edge of our headlights, I saw something run across the road, super fast. So fast I almost thought it was glare on my glasses. I didn't say anything at first, because my husband doesn't believe in paranormal stuff, Bigfoot or the like. I happened to look over, and he had a weird look on his face. I asked if he had just seen that, and he said, "Yep." I said, "Something really tall and thin?" "Yep." Now this part I was afraid to say, because I thought he would think I was crazy, but I said it anyway. I asked if it looked like a very tall stick, like a thin tree or stick from a tree with arms and legs. He said it did. It really bothered both of us. I've never seen anything like it, and I didn't even realize it was a thing until I started to Google it. I've seen ghosts and things, but nothing like this. This thing was just so fast. You blinked and it was gone. And when I say tall, it was like 10 feet, maybe more. We saw it for just a second in our headlights. I saw it for maybe 2 steps before we passed it, arms swinging very thin. It looked like a twig with arms and legs. If my husband hadn't seen it too, I would have never have believed I'd actually seen it. I know people doubt it, but I know I saw something. I was around 7 or 8 years old when this happened. One weekend I was visiting my grandparents, who at the time lived in the countryside. I'm from Bosnia, in Europe. They were only about an hour's drive away, and we went there early in the morning. Their house is in a wooded area, with a long winding road that led up to each individual house, of which there weren't many, perhaps 3 or 4 more. I knew the area well, since I went to visit almost every weekend. Beside going up to the houses, there is one section of the road that leads directly into the woods on a sort of natural trail. Our car broke down exactly around that spot, flat tire. Since we were very close to where my grandparents live, and my folks knew I was familiar with the area, they let me go on a walk while my dad fixed the tire. It was around 9 to 10 a.m. in the morning, so they weren't really afraid to let me run around a bit. Being the curious kid that I was, I went into the forest trail since the main dirt road wasn't very exciting. The trees were very tall and dense, so even during the daytime it was kind of dark. I went up to the forest trail for a few hundred meters in until I came to a crossroads. Now, this was more than 20 years ago, but it left a lasting impression on me. In the middle of the crossroads, at the very point in the roads where they fork, there is a strange opening of a cave. I went a bit closer and noticed what appeared to be fireflies sparkling in the pitch-dark hole. Beside that, I just felt this presence, as if I wasn't alone there, as if the cavern was beckoning me to enter. And then I noticed what seemed like several pairs of small red eyes peering at me from the darkness. At this point I was quite spooked, thinking it was an animal of some kind, and decided not to go any further in and just slowly back away. This is in Southeast Europe. There aren't many dangerous animals around. Very rarely a wolf or bear would be sighted, but usually nowhere near human settlements. Nothing followed me, and I had no trouble getting back, and I decided not to tell my parents about it, since I figured they would be mad and would not let me play unsupervised for the remainder of our visit. They decided to leave me with my grandparents and pick me up on Monday, when they went back during the afternoon. I'm very close with my grandmother. She and I are very alike, especially now as a grown-up. So I told her about the encounter. She laughed it off, saying, "Honey, there's nothing in there." I walk there every day, but I was adamant about what I saw, and she agreed that we would go for a walk together and visit that spot. It wasn't far from her house, and we arrived there that same afternoon. We got to the crossroads, and like she said, there was nothing there. No burrow/cave, just a flat spot where the crossroads met. No traces of it being dug up or buried. Grandma even asked me, "Are you sure it was here?" And I replied yes. She didn't think too much of it, chalking it up to a childish imagination, but she told me not to venture out there on my own again. We continued our walk, and I just stopped mentioning the event from then on out. But to this day, even all these years later, I still remember it quite vividly. I even find it strange I'm able to recall the details, and of course, I know memories can be distorted over time, and that we think we remember, but it may not always be the full picture since our brain fills in the blanks. But I don't feel like it was the case with this. I often contemplate what would have happened had I stepped closer, or worse, tried to enter the dark cave. I have read about evil places in forests around the world, or places where time and space can be warped somewhat. People walking into what they describe as a different timeline, or other dimension. Maybe this was one of those places. My grandparents don't live there anymore. Grandpa passed away when I was 16, and my grandma moved to the city in the same building as me and my folks. We still own the house and land there, but I haven't been back in years. My dad goes to clean up and check things a few times a year. According to him, the house and land have almost been consumed by the vegetation. They cut the water and electricity so they wouldn't pay the bills, so it's not convenient going. But I do plan going there at some point, perhaps during my next time off or vacation from work. I really want to go back to the road, just to see if I feel anything. And now that I'm an adult with an interest in the paranormal, maybe I'll have some kind of revelation when I get there. My boyfriend and I camped through California, and we stayed at a campsite near Santa Barbara for 2 nights. The first night it was just us and another camper across from us, and the second night it was only us at the campgrounds. There wasn't much near this campground, and it was about a 30-minute drive into Santa Barbara. It had started raining around 2 a.m., which woke me up a little bit, and I was just lying there trying to get back to sleep. I was almost asleep when I heard what sounded like a car crash. I laid there for a second and then decided to ask my boyfriend if he was awake. He answered, so I asked him if he just heard what I heard. He said he had, and we decided to go check it out and make sure they were okay. We get out of the tent and grabbed the flashlight and started walking where we thought we heard the wreck happen. When this person hops back in their truck, turns their lights on and frantically leaves the campground. This freaks my boyfriend and I out because this person was driving the wrong way through the campground with his headlights on towards our campsite, and we were the only ones there. The campground was lined with large rocks, and that is what he ran into. The fact that he was creeping right through the campground like this makes me and my boyfriend believe that he was there with bad intentions, and we slept poorly for the rest of the night. When I was around 14, in 2003, I went on a camping trip with my mother and stepfather and 4 younger siblings. We were never a very well-off family. In fact, we were quite poor. I never went on holidays abroad, and we would always usually go camping to the same campsite, which felt like miles away, but in reality was less than 10 miles from the city where we lived. We had been there a few times previously and knew the campsite and surrounding area fairly well. It felt pretty safe and familiar. On this occasion, everything was going pretty normal, but I hated camping. My parents would always argue when it came to putting up the tent. It was pretty boring being in the woods, and I would normally be the one entertaining my siblings. I hated not having electricity, access to proper toilets or showers. It could be quite fun looking back, and I do have treasured memories I have with my stepdad who is no longer with us. Usually we would go on long hikes or bike rides, with my stepdad using maps to charter our way to a small village promising to get us all ice cream, which was a real treat as we never usually had it. On this camping trip, we were going to go on a 10-mile bike ride. Both my parents had their own bikes along with my sister and I. My stepdad's bike had the small trailer where my 3 younger siblings, all under the age of 5, sat. It was hard work going on these epic bike rides, but I rather enjoyed being in the middle of the woods surrounded by nature. We weren't in the middle of nowhere, but it was remote enough for it to be inaccessible to public transport. Only forest ranger type vehicles could access the roads. They weren't real paved roads with tarmac, more like dirt roads, which were only really suited for bicycles. During all the times we went camping, we never saw any other vehicles go down these roads. On this day, we were all cycling down this road when suddenly we heard the sounds of vehicles coming up slowly behind us. My stepdad in front of us, when he stops and tells us to move aside to let the vehicles come past. There's a sense of urgency and confusion in his tone, as he's unsure why there's even a vehicle here. The vehicle passes us, and we were expecting to see a forest ranger vehicle, you know, the 4x4 pickup or Land Rover kinds, but instead we see an estate/station wagon kind of car with a long body and large trunk with a window in the back. In the back of this station wagon, I see several large trash bags, and it's a very strange sight. I may only be a teenager, but this is a sight that sets off alarm bells for several reasons. 1. This is not a car that is designed for going off-road in the woods. As previously mentioned, we have never encountered any vehicles down this bike road before. The person driving is clearly not lost, as they didn't stop to ask for directions. There are big black trash bags in the back of the car that look very suspicious. What I mean by this point is they are full and tied up very tight. We could all see into the back of the car, and I didn't see anything poking out of the bag to indicate it was full of garbage. The driver looked very rough, and I don't mean to sound rude, but he looked mean. I can't recall his features, just that he did not look like a friendly person that belonged in the countryside. He wore dark clothing. I think he was clean shaven with short hair. I just wish I remember more of what the guy looked like. As if this incident couldn't get any stranger, what took place next has left such an impression on me that I still recall the sense of fear that I felt at the time as I share this. The car drives on several more feet. The driver stops. For what feels like the longest time in my entire life, nothing happens. We're all watching the car. My stepdad told us to remain still. He's very serious, assessing the situation. Then the car's reverse lights come on, and the car starts reversing to us. My stepdad, who was in the army for several years, was one of the toughest guys I knew, goes into full-on panic mode and tells us to run. We don't even get on our bicycles to ride. Instead, we flee on foot, running with our bicycles through the woods until we find a railway bridge which we'd previously passed over. We never looked back. I have no idea if the man got out of his car to look for us. I don't know if he just continued driving. I had no idea what was in those bags. We never really spoke about what happened that day. I know it was something that seriously scared my stepdad because of his response, and it left us frightened about who I might encounter in the woods to this very day. When I was 8 years old, I was living in Milford, Michigan. There was a slightly wooded field across from my aunt's farm property, down from a mobile home park called Child's Lake. I was walking with her dog, who started digging, and I went over and picked up a jawbone. I thought it was cool, so I brought it home, and my aunt told me it must be an animal's jawbone, and I went home. I found out later they found a few victims of a serial killer called Leslie Allen Williams buried out there. It turns out that he had killed 4 girls from the area. I turned it over to police. I didn't want to keep some poor murdered girl's jawbone, even if the police wouldn't have needed it as evidence. Her family at least deserved the remains. It was a very unsettling experience all in all. My husband Paul is not a believer in the paranormal, the ghostly, or cryptids. I, on the other hand, love to read, watch videos and hear stories of the eerie and supernatural that others have experienced or written about. Even though Paul is cynical and smirks at me when I attempt to interest him with a story or video that I think is compelling, he has had a few rather odd experiences. Here is one of them that occurred in early 1970. One day, Paul and his ex-wife Greta and a guy they knew called Bob took a drive far out in the desert in Bob's camper to drop some acid and explore an old ghost town called Tumco, just north of Yuma in Arizona. As they began to come onto the drug, Bob began to seem a bit strange, not dangerous or anything, but strange. Not normally as one would expect under the circumstances. They spread out a bit, each involved in their own trip, musing and interests. What was left of the town was basically old adobe foundations of limited interest in their current condition. As he explored his surroundings, Paul walked up a rise above Tumco to see what might be there and for the view it would provide. As he created the rise, he came upon a graveyard and began to explore and read some of the gravestones. Of course, they were all from 1850 and 60, and eventually, he found himself standing at the end of a cowboy's grave, as he began musing about who had lived and died in this place, what their lives were like in this old mining town, and who this man may have been, and what might have been buried with him. With this thought, he began to develop a personality for the man who was buried here. He was a prominent man of Tumco who had made it big in mining. Therefore, he was a wealthy man, with property, nice clothes, good women, and probably had some expensive jewelry, maybe a ring of some value that was buried with him? What else could be there? What about the other graves? This train of thought led to, how long before it's okay to dig up a grave? How old does it have to be before no one cares? It's okay to dig up Egyptians, and at the time, it's okay to dig up Indians and people from the Middle Ages. It seems like it's been plenty long enough. 100 years, sure, why not? The graves are obvious in a state of neglect, so who would know, right? How long would it take? Could we do it in a few hours? But as he meandered down this avenue of thought, he got cold feet as he realized that probably the Victorians might still be a bit fresh, so maybe this wasn't such a great idea. The possibility of getting caught was too small, but still, the thought was intriguing. Finally, after some time, with his drug-induced daydreaming, he decided against grave robbing. He turned and began to walk away towards the camper to rejoin Greta and Bob. But just as he cleared the crest of the rise on his way back, thwack! From behind him, a cholla cactus ball slammed into the back of his lower right arm and stuck there. This was a bit of a shock to say the least. He immediately whirled around to see who the hell would do such a thing, but there was no one there. This left him feeling a bit perplexed, but although the thought crossed his mind that perhaps an angry ghost had tossed the cholla cactus ball at him for thinking of violating their graves, he dismissed it. He didn't believe in ghosts. He began rationalizing and decided maybe he had brushed up against one without realizing it. Then when he swung his arm back, he encountered it. However, there was still some cholla cacti in the vicinity. There were none anywhere close him though. A bit spooked, he pulled the painful cactus ball off his arm and proceeded back to the camper, followed by an eeriness that now seemed to cloak the town. But the strangeness did not end there. After rejoining Greta and Bob, Bob's strange vibes continued. Paul could not assess him or his motives at all. He was trying to figure out if maybe it was because Bob wanted to have more intimate relations with Greta, or maybe he was thinking of killing them. Why was he behaving so strangely? Bob continued to act strangely and a bit unpredictably, making everyone feel uncomfortable and wary. Finally, early in the evening, the decision was made to head back home. It was a long drive, so Greta climbed into the back of the camper, while Bob drove and Paul sat shotgun. The road was not paved and meandered along through the desert. As night fell, they were moving along slowly, still feeling a bit awkward, but things were beginning to mellow. As they rounded a bend into the road, they came upon a strange scene. At the side of the road, off about 50 yards or so, was, at best as Paul can describe, an eerie golden yellowish luminescent glowing craft. The glow seemed to surround us and at the same time was part of it. The craft was sitting on long legs, and there was a ramp dropped out from underneath with a couple of aliens in sort of whitish, sort of silverish suits. Bubble-headed, large, black-eyed, narrowed chins on the tall side. Aliens in strange silverish suits walking down the ramp out of this glowing craft thing. to join another couple of aliens already standing on the ground outside of it. As they slowly drove by, there was a moment of silence and incredulity. Then Paul turned to Bob and asked, "Did you just see that?" Bob nervously answered, "Yes." However, as they turned back to look for a second look, the scene had completely changed. There was a roaring fire reflecting off the metal of an old white truck with a silver campus shell on the back. And sitting around that roaring campfire, drinking their cups, were a handful of desert rats dressed in khaki-colored clothes. You know, the type of old fogies depicted in old westerns that have been out in the desert hunting for buried treasure, whose clothes match the desert. Yeah, like that. According to Ross Coulthart, a famous Australian journalist, there is a reported by the US Department of Defense that whatever this alien phenomenon is, they are able to manipulate and alter human consciousness and perception. At any rate, they finally got home wondering to this day what in the hell they saw. So maybe, just maybe, they really did see aliens. Oh, and by the way, Bob never murdered them, and nothing ever happened between him and Greta either. So my great-grandpa fought in World War II. He was drafted in 1943 when he was 23. He's 103 years old now. Just a few days ago, he told me a story that he says is the most horrifying experience in his life. I asked him if it was about Japanese soldiers, because those guys were vicious back in the day. He told me no, it was something else. I don't know if this story's true or not, but it gave me chills. He said no one ever believed their story, but he still remembers it clear as day, and it still gives him nightmares when he dwells upon it. So, in 1943 he was stationed in the Philippines along with others to hold off the Japanese. However, one day he and his friend Samuel, who unfortunately passed away decades ago, got separated from their platoon. They were in a province making their way through the forest within the mountain area, when they both got lost and separated. My great-grandpa forgot which province it was, but he said there were a lot of forests and villages, so he and Samuel were looking and calling out for their comrades, when they ventured deeper and deeper till they reached the end of the forest. I asked him, why didn't you just radio your platoon? He told me he did, but for some unknown reason the communications were scrambled and unintelligible. It concerned both him and Samuel, but Samuel said they needed to keep calm and tread carefully in case they ran into Japanese soldiers. So they both made it out of the forest, but then they noticed that the sun was about to set. My great-grandpa told Samuel that they needed to set up a camp, and Samuel agreed. That's when he noticed something off in the distance. It was a small wooden hut. They both decided to camp inside, so they made their way over to the hut. They knocked on the door and checked the place, but there were no signs of people anywhere, but there were clothes scattered around the ground. My great-grandpa said that maybe they fled in a panic, to which Samuel agreed. So my great-grandpa and Samuel set up camp and ate dinner. Samuel proposed the idea of taking shifts throughout the night to keep a lookout, just in case they get caught in their sleep by the Japanese. So they both woke each other up and took each place as a lookout while the other person slept. While great-grandpa was sleeping, Samuel abruptly woke him up and told him, "I spotted movement." My great-grandpa grabbed his rifle and asked him, "Where?" Samuel gave the binoculars to Grandpa and pointed in a direction. "I saw them in a field 300 yards away." Great-grandpa looked through the binoculars in the direction Samuel pointed at. At first he didn't see anything, but then he spotted something moving in the dark. However, when great-grandpa looked closer, it was just a wild boar. "It's just a pig," Grandpa told Samuel. Samuel took the binoculars to see for himself. "That's weird. It's just standing there," Samuel said. Grandpa looked at Samuel in confusion and asked what he meant. Samuel then said that the boar wasn't moving or anything, it was just staring at them from afar, and that it was starting to weird him out. Grandpa just laughed it off and told Samuel that it was probably just his mind playing tricks on him. But then something odd happened. The oil lamp that served as their light source inside the hut began going out. Grandpa went over to light it back up, and afterwards went back to his sleeping bag. but then the light suddenly went out again. He went to check on it again, thinking the oil probably went out. But the strange thing was there was still plenty of oil. My great-grandpa lit it back up again and went back to sleep. But the flame went out again. That's when a terrified Samuel frantically went up to him and said, "It's gone." "What the hell are you talking about?" "The pig had just disappeared into thin air." At this point, Grandpa was starting to get freaked. Great-grandpa then asked him to explain. Samuel said that he was watching the boar through the binoculars when it suddenly just vanished out of existence. Suddenly, a loud thud came from above them, as if something landed on the roof. Great-grandpa and Samuel grabbed their rifles. "We need to get the hell out of here," Samuel said. Grandpa said the rest of the events that happened are one of the worst nightmares of his entire life. Great-grandpa told Samuel not to panic and stay low and quiet, so they did, while tightly gripping their guns close. A few moments later, Samuel started screaming. Grandpa turned on his light and saw something straight out of a horror movie. Something that looked like a tongue which lodged in Samuel's neck. His friend was screaming in pain, trying to remove it from the neck. Great-grandpa snapped out of his shock and shot at the ceiling multiple times to hit whatever the tongue belonged to. After a few more shots, the tongue released Samuel and slowly retracted back into the hole on the ceiling. Samuel was gripping the side of his neck tightly and screaming as blood trickled down. Grandpa put a cloth against the wound and told him to keep pressure on it. After they collected all of their things and exited the cabin and made a break for it, Grandpa turned around and shined his light on the hut's roof. And what he saw, he described as the most evil-looking and ugliest thing he had ever seen. I asked him to describe what it looked like. He said it was humanoid. It had 2 gigantic wings that were bigger than its own body. The wings looked like a combination of a bat's and a hawk's. Its eyes were blood red and glowed in the dark, skin black as coal, wild unkept hair and huge fangs that were visible even through its closed mouth. It just sat there perching on the roof staring at them. Grandpa acted quickly. He raised his rifle and began shooting at the thing, unloading all the rounds in the gun's chamber. Samuel did the same. But to their astonishment, the creature was unfazed and just continued to stare at them unbothered. At that point, Grandpa and Samuel began screaming like maniacs while running for the hills. By some miracle, the creature did not pursue them. They were both so scared, and they didn't care if they ran into the enemy, so long as they didn't encounter whatever the hell that was again. They managed to make it till morning and came across a small village, where they rested in. That's when they learned from one of the locals that what attacked them was called an aswang, and that they were very common in the countryside. The locals told them that they were all in God's favor because they survived. After a few days, they were eventually reunited with their platoon. When they shared this story, only a few believed them, while the others thought they were probably drunk and ran into enemy gunfire, hence the injury on Samuel's neck. After the war ended, they all went home, but he could never forget the horrifying encounter that gave him severe PTSD. Samuel unfortunately passed away at the age of 80 due to a stroke. His story honestly freaked me out. I spent the good part of an hour googling aswangs and what they are. I'd love to get your thoughts on this. I work as a child care professional, and one of the kids that I looked after had recently gotten into hiking. I decided to take him to a really cool trail in Salt Fort State Park, where we were all set to hike to Hosak's cave after parking right near the beginning of the trailhead. The entire trail is about half a mile, which is why I chose this trail for our hike that day. I also chose this trail because any time I had been on it before, it was very busy and full of people, and a very popular spot which made me feel secure. However, this past summer, we had a cluster of several summer storms which caused massive damage to the trail. So to my surprise, it was much more difficult and completely empty. I wasn't bothered by the trail being obviously empty, because there was a small construction crew working on a bridge that was just barely visible from the trailhead. He was still up for the hike, despite the entire width of the trail being washed out until it was no more than a foot wide, with a 6 to 12 foot drop into a creek bed that is solid rock and several trees down. He is very athletic, and I was confident in his abilities, and he was so excited to tackle our adventure. We made it all the way to the platform that allows you to see the entire cave. There were many downed trees surrounding the platform, and it was actually closed at this point. But we had made it this far, so we decided to maneuver around the platform and proceeded that few hundred feet into the cave. We spent the most time in this area due to the difficulty, so I know exactly what it looked like. There were tree roots directly under the platform, and you could climb down on either side. It's also worth noting that Hosak's cave is much more like a cliff, with an overhanging rock formation and a trickle of waterfall directly in the middle. It's not a creepy closed-up cave, it's open and beautiful. We got to the cave and I noticed a candle that was not burning recently, but had at some point been sitting on a large rock that had a heart carved into it. I chalked it up to someone having a date or something and disregarded it. He wanted to climb to the top, where I noticed 2 more candles and 3 stacks of small rocks that had been stacked up by somebody. I definitely felt weird at this point, because it was about this time that he found a small puddle full of baby salamanders and wanted to catch them. It was the happiest I'd seen him in a very long time, and I didn't have the heart to tell him that it was time to go. So we spent about an hour catching baby salamanders, and I watched him have the time of his life. We finally decided to leave when we got to the platform. Dead center in the middle of the tree roots was a wet washcloth, hanging, that was absolutely not there before. He noticed it as well, but did not pick up the severity of the situation we were in. At that moment, I factually knew 2 things. Someone was watching us, and we did not see them, and they were now potentially hiding in the woods, and made it a point to not be seen but to leave an object to be noticed. There was no running back to the narrow trail, and I was not going to tell him that we might have been in danger. I told him to go in front of me, and just kept encouraging him that he was doing great over and over, and that seemed to speed him up naturally. I never saw anyone while we were on the trail. We got to the car and I locked the doors immediately. On our way out of the park, a very dirty man in his 30s came out of the woods and made it a point to stare at me with the most empty expression I've ever seen. The man followed me with his eyes and head as I drove by him, and continued to stare at me until I couldn't see him anymore. I knew the third fact at that point. He made it a point to make himself apparent to me, and that fact 1 and fact 2 were true. That scare stuck with me for days, and I considered counseling after it, as it scared and bothered me for several weeks, giving me anxiety. I tried to tell myself perhaps we were just interrupting his bath time, and he was camped and didn't want to startle us. After all, the crazy-looking man had ample time to do anything he wanted while we were catching salamanders. I just cannot in any way rationalize why he stared into my eyes the way he did, as if he wanted to go unnoticed. Deep down, I know that it's much more likely that it was a deliberate action intending to scare me. He never had any idea how panicked, and to this day it was the most fun I've ever seen him have. He brings it up regularly, and it was a very positive experience for him. It was one of the worst experiences ever, and it made me feel so sick and disturbed. For context, both me and my friend are reasonably scrawny teenage girls. We were camping, and it was very foggy outside, and it was like mid-evening. So my friend and I were hanging out at the beach, looking at all the sandcastles from the competition that took place earlier that day, and we had to use the bathroom and wash the sand off our feet. So we were washing her feet, and I was going to the bathroom, and I heard the distinct sound of keys jangling. So after I got out of the bathroom, my friend was waiting for me just outside, and I asked her if she'd seen anyone leave the bathroom, but she had just gotten there apparently. We were standing around when I heard the noise of keys again. I looked up and saw a man. He was in his mid to late 20s, early 30s at latest. He had extremely greasy blonde hair sunken eyes and a hoodie with the hood up. Overall, a pretty sketchy looking dude. He circled the bathrooms me and my friend were standing by a few times after that, but he was always watching us whenever we were in view, which I took note of. My friend still didn't notice though. A minute or two later, she asked me if I wanted to go sit at a picnic table with her, and I accepted because I wanted to get away from him. So we walked over to the table, but he followed us, and I know because of his key. We sat at the table, and she was talking to her boyfriend on Snapchat, and I was reading over her shoulder as I normally do. But while I was reading with her, I told her that the guy was watching us, and about what I noticed before we went to the table. As I was telling her about it, I felt like I was being watched, so I looked over and made direct eye contact with the guy who had the keys. After we both gave him an awkward smile, he broke eye contact and walked to another man who I didn't get a good look at. They kept looking at my friend and I, so we got up and walked over to the little playground near where we were, and we just kind of talked, but this time she was paying attention to where the guys were. Not even a minute later, the two men walked by over a small patch of woods that had a red car parked near it. Due to where I was sitting, I couldn't see the men anymore, but my friend could, and she said that the blonde one kept peeking back at us from behind a tree, and the other one was out of sight. So we decided to use this to our advantage as we ran over to the little restaurant type thing, which gave us a clear view of them and a clear view of us. A blonde guy got into the car with who we believed to be the other guy. Now our fight or flight was kicking in, and we both chose flight. So we went behind the restaurant, which was closed and had been so for about an hour, ran down the stairs behind a transport truck that had been there since earlier. My friend and I looked out from behind the truck and saw the car from earlier circling around the area. So as soon as it was out of sight, we ran as fast as we could, and thankfully there were other people around, so we calmed down, knowing that the guys probably wouldn't come for us with other people there. We made it back to our campsite safely and watched movies and stuff before we went to bed. And we didn't see the guys for the rest of the trip. Now I know that probably wasn't the scariest encounter out there, but it left us shaken to the core, because who knows what would have happened if I wasn't always hyper aware of my surroundings. When I was around 12, my friend's dad Carl took us camping up in the Blue Mountains. My friend's aunt and uncle and some cousins would meet up there later with their fifth wheel. We got there and Carl started setting up the tent. The campsite was probably around 10 to 15 designated campsites with a small public bathroom, but we were the only people there. So while Carl was setting up the tent, my friend and I were farting around the big empty area, going down by the river and just being douchey 12-year-olds. We were around 40 to 50 feet away from our tent when this old, little red pickup pulled in with an older couple inside. The man looked sickly, long, greasy hair, older and sweating profusely. These people get out of their truck and start telling Carl to pack up the tent to get out of there, because we were in their campsite, even though the whole place was empty. My friend and I stopped what we were doing and started to watch and listen to the conversation, because the guy started getting really angry, raising his voice at Carl and getting in his face and cussing him out. Carl is trying to defuse the situation, but the older guy goes back to his truck and grabs something from under the seat. He starts walking towards Carl, and in his hands is a machete. He's acting like he's going to attack Carl. Carl yells at us to get into the truck now, and he follows. We pull out of the campsite and called the ranger. The ranger came, and all he did was send the couple to another campsite down the road. My friend and I were terrified all night the guy was going to come back for us, especially when it got dark and we were exploring around the woods away from the adults and the campsite. Deep in the backcountry of Montana, my mom was hiking up a mountain to get to a crystal dig site. She got separated from her group near the end of a trail and was the first to reach the top of the mountain. As she stood on the trail, she saw what she described as a 4 by 6 foot piece of black cloth or silk whipping through the trees, hovering about 8 feet off the ground. She was startled but not afraid, as she sensed that the thing was aware of her presence and was fleeing from her as quickly as it could. She said it moved like the Ewoks moving through the trees in Star Wars. This occurred in 2017, and ever since my mum has posted on countless places online asking if anyone had seen this black silk thing in the woods, and for years no one ever had. But recently, a group that studies this sort of thing reached out to her and asked for more details, and informed her that it appears to be a new phenomenon, but sightings have been on the rise. If anyone has seen anything like it, I would love to hear about it. About 8 years ago, I was in class at VWU, in a building on downtown campus overlooking the river. It was probably about 8:30 to 9 a.m., a clear day with the sun beginning to rise. I was seated near the front, and the projector and fluorescent classroom lights were rather bright, so to give my eyes a little break, I turned to look out the window. After a moment or two, an object appeared and slowly flew past it. I was looking straight at it and watched it for about 15 seconds as it passed the 2 sets of windows and then went out of sight. It was a football-shaped, brushed, metallic kind of thing. The gold light of the sunrise reflected off it, with no obvious wings, tail, propellers or lights. It made no sound that I could tell, and appeared to be on a gradual descent. This was mid-lecture, and of course no one else noticed. The professor was a bit serious, and I couldn't scream out, "Oh my god, guys, look, a UFO!" I was dying, though, that no one else had seen it, because I wanted to go, "What the hell is that?" In any case, I never in a million years thought I would see a UFO. I had always leaned towards the feeling that people were making UFO stories up, or that they were imagining things. I have no idea what it was that I saw, other than being 100% sure that I saw it. I got such a good look at it. I was able to notice all the details, and this was pre-drones, but it also looked nothing like any drone I've ever seen since, and was definitely not an airplane. I'm an outdoorsman. I'm very experienced in hunting, camping, hiking, and general survival, and I'm very familiar and used to wildlife. And I was charged by what I believe to be a cryptid called the Dogman. It charged me and my cousin. It was not a bear cannot move how it did, and it was not a normal wolf, as they cannot comfortably run on 2 legs, whereas what charged us seemed natural at doing so. This happened around June or July of 2007. I was 17 years old, and more cocky then, but still knowledgeable of the outdoors. My family used to own a cabin in northwest Wisconsin, and I basically grew up there in the summer. I knew the woods well, but at night, it was wise to stay in the cabin or at least by the bonfire of the beach, because of bears, wolves, and cougars. One of the creepiest things were if you were having a bonfire, the tree line was visible from the fire pit and beach, and at night, you always felt like you were being watched from that tree line. But during the day, the woods always seemed normal, not so creepy. That is until this incident. So this happened somewhere between midday and 2. Me and my cousin were having an airsoft battle. I was in full woodland camo, he was not, and I retreated onto the ATV trail in the woods for a tactical advantage, and our battle took us about 200 meters into about a third of the way up the trail. We'd had enough at this point, and were standing at the edge of a clearing on the trail talking, and he was maybe 10 feet in front of me, when I decided to mess with him. I shushed him and said, "We're being watched." He froze. Then I realized the woods were dead quiet, and I got spooked and started scanning the tree line and the other edge of the clearing from left to right when I saw it. Its teeth gave it away. It was panting and staring at my cousin. I don't expect you to believe me, but what I saw looked like a wolf as big as a black bear, at least 300 pounds. It wasn't normal. This wolf was on two legs, crouching next to a tree, with its arm grasping the tree with its clawed hand. It had reddish-brown fur, and I just told my cousin simply that we had to go. The next thing I knew, he is sprinting, and I look back at Wolfie, who had locked eyes and sprinted a few steps on 2 feet, and then I turned and ran. When it looked like Wolfie was dropping to all fours, it charged us and sounded right on our asses, barreling through the brush, but for whatever reason let us go when we broke out of the tree line and headed for the cabin. What stuck with me the most was the sheer size. It appeared to be nearly 7 feet tall when upright, and that where it should have had its front paws appeared to have large clawed hands. Now I'm not sure how to explain it away rationally, and I've heard wolves will occasionally kind of walk upright, but as far as I know, they can't sprint on 2 legs. Nor do wolves get that big, and black bears more waddle on 2 legs. The closest description is silly, a werewolf or dogman, but I can't for the life of me think of anything else that sounds remotely similar to the events I saw that day. I was in Edinburgh with a few friends, and we had booked one of these tours around the old town that takes you through the underground vaults. Towards the end of the underground vaults tour, I was at the back of the group and peeked into one of the rooms where there was a man just casually leaning against a wall, 1 foot propped up against the wall, arms folded. His clothes looked quite old too. I couldn't really recall much about him other than that, as initially I thought maybe he was an actor who was just going to come out behind us and scare us, so I quickly popped my head back out and continued on without saying another word. At the end of the tour though, I don't remember anyone coming out behind us, and it didn't really seem like that kind of tour to begin with. Some people have suggested the guy may have just been on his lunch break, but what got to me was that he was just in the vaults by himself, leaning against a wall in the dark. It seemed a bit odd to me. Maybe a ghost, maybe not. But I do wonder who it was and why he was there. About 10 years ago, there were 4 of us walking through the woods local to us. To get to the best entrance to the woods, you have to walk through a crematorium. There was me, Thomas, Lisa, and Alice, and we had all planned to go camping in the woods. We had been camping in these woods on many occasions, and I had a very easygoing mum, so the parents of the other 3 would call my mum to ask if we were having a sleepover at my house. My mum, being so nice, said we could. We were all 13 at the time. We were walking through the woods to where we normally camped, and on the way we walked past a man with an axe. He didn't speak, just stared us out. We walked on and brushed it off. That night went on as you would expect. Having fun, trying to drink and not be sick, and just have a laugh with friends. We went in the woods to sleep at around 3 a.m. About 20 minutes later, we heard what sounded like trees being axed down. The sound echoed around the woods and made us all alert. This went on for about 5 minutes, and then as soon as it started, Thomas joked about the man with an axe, and Alice got rather upset with him. Time had passed, and as we were just about to sleep, we heard footsteps approaching. They were circling around our tent. We all sat up in shock and began to panic. We heard logs of wood being dropped outside the tent. We could feel the wood as it struck the floor, and we gained the courage to look out of the tent as we peered out. He was there, sat on the floor, staring into the tent as we opened it. We all bailed and ran as fast as we could from the woods. All this time we never heard him talk. 10 years on, none of us have stepped into those woods again. My partner and I were on Vancouver Island, British Columbia, doing what most young couples do. Take a van, put a mattress in the back, and drive around the island camping in random woods. The weekend we chose was particularly busy, so every campsite was full. The thing with Vancouver Island is that it's a lot of logging roads with many pull-offs. We were travelling from one old-growth forest to another when it was getting dark. We found a random turn-off that had an old gate ripped off, very common, and pulled into an area lakeside. As we pulled up, we noticed there was a fire with another couple, one other van, and a tent on the other side. We got out, chatted with a couple who were quite nice, and asked about the tent. Turns out it was empty when they got there the night before. Now this wasn't some run-down tent. It was quite new, had a brand new paddleboard, books lying around the fireplace, a hammock strewn up, but whatever, we didn't give it a second thought. My partner and I went to bed early, got up and the van was gone, but the tent was still empty. We didn't think anything of it, so went into town, which was a little way off. We did some hikes, explored a bit, and decided to go back to our lakeside camping spot. When we returned, the tent was still there. At this point we were wondering, it's been 3 days and no one, with all the gear lying around? My mind is now going into the worst scenario. Oh God. Has someone perished in there? At this point the sun is setting, and we're both freaking ourselves out. My partner starts joking about vampires, but I decide to look in the tent. I very reluctantly open it, and it's empty, but there is a note inside in French. Thankfully, my partner speaks French and translates it. It turns out 2 friends of this person had come to this spot expecting to meet some girl 4 days before we had gotten to this site, which means the tent had been there for at least 4 days. Now we're thinking, God, what if the person was kidnapped or killed and we're staying here? Or what if some murder is on the loose? At this point we didn't want to drive anywhere since it was starting to get dark, and everywhere else we saw was full. This is when all of a sudden, out of the bushes, comes a small shadow which scared the crap out of us. It's a pet rabbit. It hops over to us, and we notice there's rabbit food under a tarp near the tent. Probably 45 minutes later, another couple drove in with a van, and we chatted with them a bit, which helped us sleep through the night. But it definitely wasn't restful sleep. We ended up reporting the tent to the police, but as usually is the case, there was never any follow-up. I really do wonder what happened there. This happened a while ago. I was out in the woods when I walked past a campsite with a ton of smashed alcohol bottles and trash. I began feeling uncomfortable and started walking faster to where the trail looked over a canyon. It smelled something bad, and I looked down to see, like 3 feet from me, 2 bloated, dead dog heads sticking out from a rolled up tarp. Immediately I turned around and booked it to my car. I called the Forest Service to report it. I think some people got drunk and killed their dogs, or maybe it was a dog fighting thing. There may have been more under the tarp, but honestly I was too freaked out to find out what could have been under there. I think if it was someone's pet, they would have at least had the decency to try and bury it. I live in outer Sunset in San Francisco, and at around 7 p.m. I poked my head out the window to see if it was raining. It wasn't. That's when I heard a loud aircraft overhead which was several magnitudes louder than the planes that normally fly in my area. I looked to my left and saw a plane that appeared to be a commercial aircraft, but I noticed it was much larger and the lights were super bright and creating large cones of light ahead of it. I remember thinking how neat it looked, being able to see so much of the craft, an area around it lit up with such a cloudy evening. When I tried to focus in on it, the lights flickered off and I lost it completely. I could still hear it very loudly though. About 10 seconds went by and I see something come alight about 2 blocks to my right. I see a lot of commercial aircrafts out there, but this was easily 4 to 6 times larger in the sky than they normally appear. The lights were strange too. I saw what appeared to be 4 white jet exhausts, and across the whole craft there were blue and red lights in lines now slowly glimmering. It moved much slower than regular planes and was visible for about 10 seconds, moving north along the beach. It then vanished after about 10 seconds. Confused as hell, I looked around to see if anyone else had witnessed it. Lo and behold, Someone on the corner of my street who was riding their bike had stopped and was gazing up at the sky in the same location as the craft. I shouted down to them, "Hey, did you see that? What was it?" They turned to look at me, back at the sky and then back at me, and without saying anything got on their bike and rode away. I could still hear the craft, so I got onto my roof, and about half a minute or so later I saw it come from behind me and slowly fly west out over the ocean until it just vanished. I stayed on my roof waiting to catch it again, but I didn't hear or see it after. Maybe about 20 minutes regular aircrafts began flying overhead as per usual. My best guess is that it may have been some sort of military aircraft, or perhaps several in a very tight formation. It's the loudest and largest aircraft I've ever seen. Thanks for nothing, dude on a bike. Or could it have been perhaps something otherworldly? This happened about a year ago during the summer. Something you should keep in mind is that the house I had lived in had 1 acre of land surrounding the house. Where I had lived was near farmland. I had woken up around 8 in the morning on my living room couch, having fallen asleep the previous night, as well as my mother and sister who were sleeping next to me. I had planned to watch this movie I hadn't finished the previous night on my laptop, as well as eat breakfast in the dining room of the house. I had sat down at the end of this dining table, which was the closest chair to the kitchen. Keep in mind, if I leaned back on the chair, I would see right into the further side of the kitchen, where the door that led to my desk was, which had this huge window right next to the door. So I turned on my movie and started to eat my breakfast, as my dog trotted over to me and sat next to me. I believe I was about 45 minutes into the movie when my dog switched her spot, now sitting right under the archway that led to the kitchen staring at God knows what. I felt her move, but I didn't really think anything of it. If it was serious, she would have been barking like hell. About 10 to 20 minutes go by and I glance over at my dog, noticing she's still staring at something. This time, I heard shuffling/scratching over in the kitchen. I called out her name, but she just wouldn't move. So when I walked over, I followed her trail of vision and noticed she was staring at the window in the kitchen that leads to the deck of the house. I nearly crapped myself when I saw something or someone behind the window outside, peeping through the blinds. I forgot to mention there was a chair on the deck right under that specific window, so whatever the hell that was had to have been balancing on the chair to look inside. It looked bald almost, and white with a pinkish tone. It had been holding onto the window frame, peering at my dog and I, while scratching the screen on the window with this horrible, heavy breathing. I remember thinking in the moment it was a person trying to break in because whatever it was wanted to get in so desperately. The thing was sort of small, and it seemed as if it didn't want me to see the rest of its face, only its eyes. The whole time my dog had been watching whatever that thing was and not barking. I'm saying this because something as simple as the dropping of a cup will send my dog into a fit, barking like crazy. Even a voice coming from the TV would cause a great few minutes of barking from her. Now, as I said, I believed someone was trying to get in, so I ran over to the couch in the living room, shaking my mother awake and bringing her to the kitchen. And of course, at that time, whatever the hell it was had disappeared. I would have thought I was losing my mind if my dog hadn't been seeing the same thing as me. I peered out another window, checking the driveway in case it was a person and they had driven here by car, but there was nothing. My mother went out onto the deck and looked around, but there was nothing there, except fingerprints on the window frame. We checked around the whole yard and nothing was found except for the prints. I'm quite traumatized to this day, knowing that whatever had been there was watching me for quite a while, and I didn't know it. And also, the fact that if it was a person, it would have taken a while to get off the land. Even if they were running away, we would have caught them because the yard is huge. I'm not living in this house where this happened anymore, thankfully. And I've had other experiences which are stories for another day. But I can't stress enough just how disturbing it was. And I wonder if it could have been some creature. To me, It's a more likely explanation than a human that just vanished. This happened during a tour of the Edinburgh catacombs. I'll start off by saying that I was just abroad in England back in the fall of 2017 studying, and my friends and I went to Edinburgh for a weekend trip to explore and sightsee. One of my friends looked online and we found out that 1, Edinburgh was very haunted, and 2, they had ghost tours. So we picked one that was the cheapest as we were on a college budget. It started off pretty chill. The tour was super nice and friendly. We walked around above ground, saw where the longest hanging took place in Edinburgh and other haunted places. But then we learnt that there were catacombs in certain places and the tour would take us into one. I never knew Edinburgh had catacombs or vaults, and I was shocked and excited. I can't remember the exact place where we went, but we climbed down these stairs into a giant, cavernous space. It was dark and with some lanterns. Creepy as hell environment, and our tour guide explained how people have seen different ghosts and how most are friendly, but one is extremely mean and terrible. She said people have actually screamed and left. None that happened to me or my friend on the tour, but the entire time we were down there, I remember the back of my neck got really cold, like winter level cold. And when we went to parts where people saw the particularly mean spirits, I would feel bad vibes and the need to get out. I didn't though. I just stayed in the middle of the group and took deep breaths, and eventually when we left I felt better. When we got out we talked about the experience, and one of my friends, Nick, who was on the far edge of the group against the wall, felt worse than me. He felt his entire body get cold and started shivering. He said at one point he felt something grab his hand in the room where people saw the spectre and thought he heard whispering. We were the only 2 to get affected during the entire tour among our friends. Me and some of my good friends were going to hike in 5 miles on a Friday, fish an inaccessible section of the river for a state record, and hike out on Sunday. I say it's inaccessible because the whole river gets pushed into a canyon for 3 miles, and the only way you can fish in it is stay in the water, occasionally swimming between holes. Well, something happened, and they couldn't come down till Saturday morning. I hiked in, made sure the trail was well marked for them, and set up camp in the afternoon, and took off for the river to catch supper. I fished a few holes below camp to catch supper, and ended up catching 4 over 20 inch. I cooked them up in a frying pan, and kept hidden back there, and the sky started clouding up. Long black rolling clouds with a touch of green. I double-checked my tarps, dug a shallow ditch around my camp, and made sure my tarp was hung well over the fire, and then it came all of a sudden. It was blowing sideways. But I didn't worry. I knew how to build a strong shelter. I broke out the bottle of bourbon, I rolled it in the center of my bedroll and leaned back in my hammock and watched it just pour it down. The lightning was constant, and it started cracking all around me. I had a good view as twilight was starting off the tracks off the river. With a boom, I watched lightning strike the track and run right up the trail for 50 yards. I took a few long drinks out of the bottle and dozed off as the storm calmed. I awoke to the steady dripping of rain falling off the timber. The fire had died down to just a glow of hot coals, and I didn't set my lantern out in the rain. I dug into the pocket of my hammock for my flashlight. I had the sense to put my pistol and my flashlight in before I dozed off in my hammock. As I was rolling out of my hammock, I heard a sound in front of me within 15 yards, and then a squeal to my right, and a growl and a purr. As soon as I heard it all around me, the hair started standing up on my neck, and I couldn't place what kind of creature made all these sounds, or could it be numerous? I sat real still, waiting on a moment for whatever it was to stop, so that I could spot it with my flashlight and gun. I turned on my light, and saw eyes through the sight of my gun, eyes about 1/2 foot, setting on the moss, squalling, and I smiled. In my buzzed, sleepy state, I had left the remainder of my fish setting in the skillet on the rocks beside the fire, and a whole family of raccoons had sniffed them out. It took a few minutes to stoke the fire up with some dry pine, took the skillet full of fish and just threw them out of sight from the light of the campfire. With one loud clack, the mama called the little ones out to eat. The fire kept them scared to come any closer, but they must have been hungry, and I dozed back off into the hammock. The next morning I woke up and walked to where I had thrown the fish. They had cleaned up every bone, every drop of grease, and moved on with full bellies. This was on a private island, while I was at a month-long summer camp. Our group went on an overnight campout in the woods. So as we were walking through a particularly dense part of the woods, we found a dead fawn. We were all trying to walk around it, but it was right on the trail, so it was hard to squeeze by. As I walked around the corpse, there was a hole about 1 inch across from the front left shoulder, and blood had seeped out. We hiked on and slept the night. Then when we went back to camp on the same trail, the deer was gone, but the blood was still there. We finished our hike. Then fast forward a few days, we were walking through the trail in the camp and found another dead deer. This one was fully grown. She had 2 holes in her, one on the flank and one on the front shoulder. This time I was positive those things were bullet holes. I had been out hunting deer with my grandparents and the holes looked exactly like that. That begs the question though, who was hunting for sport on a private island that's exclusively used to host and camp for kids? It's honestly disturbing to think what could have happened had something gone wrong or a child been mistaken or whatever. You know, you get some trigger-happy people, and it's just something that plays on my mind. This happened when I was in the woods. Just as I was walking, I nearly stepped on a rattlesnake. He was curled up just under a shrub right off the trail. I was hiking with my sister, and we were laughing our asses off about something silly and just enjoying the day, when suddenly the air is filled with the exact sound of a sprinkler going off, and I'm an experienced hiker who has seen plenty of rattles over the years but didn't register a snake right away. I'm wondering why the hell there's a sprinkler going off in the middle of nowhere, when my sister looks down and yells, "Move!" and right next to my ankle is this little dude, pissed. I yelled and jumped forward. We took a few breaths and shooed him off the trail with a long stick, but holy hell do I pay better attention to low-lying shrubs on the trail now. This happened 7 years ago on the beach in eastern Massachusetts. Me, my brother, my cousin, and the girl I was with at the time were taking a long night walk along the beach, as we often did, to see the stars and such. Having very little light pollution at the edge of the continent affords us a spectacular view, much more impressive than any we could find near where we lived. We had found a nice spot sheltered by rocks to sit and soak up the sights, when my cousin and I spotted something off near the horizon. It was a bright light, nothing more, blinking on and off at regular intervals. My cousin and I debated what it was for a minute or two, and I thought it could have been a lighthouse because it was over land. Eastham is on the bay side of the cape, which overlooked the entire inner ring of land. After surveying the surrounding lights from the buildings, etc., we decided it was too far and too high in the sky to be a lighthouse. The idea that it was an airplane crossed our minds, yet it was stationary. There was no noise coming from it. Although we may not have been able to hear it from several miles away, we didn't debate it for too long. It wasn't that interesting after all. There was nothing about it that said it wasn't something ordinary. So my cousin and I went back to chat with my brother and my girlfriend, who had been talking for a few yards. And now for the part I can't explain. As we were in the middle of some of our regular banter, the three of them froze. jaws to the ground, looking behind me, and look up at the same time, and I notice my back had gotten instantly warmer. Turning to follow their stunned gaze, I looked up. Behind where I was standing, and nearly 100 feet in the air, hung a luminous orb, suspended silently in the air. People with lesser powers of observation could have merely described it as a light in the sky. Yet I am here to tell you it was infinitely more interesting than that. It was no ordinary light. I'm willing to bet that almost anybody old enough to know the difference is able to tell what kind of light is being emitted by any device, natural or otherwise. Even when not directly facing the light, most of us would be able to discern the difference between light cast by an incandescent bulb and a halogen lamp, an LED, a laser, a TV set, the sun, the moon, fire, you get the picture. This light had a quality that I had never seen before or since in this life. One more time, with emphasis. This light was like nothing I have ever witnessed on Earth before. It was incredibly bright, but it didn't hurt to look at. Even though it was nighttime, it was bluish and gave off an energy that I could feel against my face, similar to the sun's rays. It looked liquid, almost alive, much like bioluminescence. Upon looking at it, all four of us certainly were stunned into silence as we looked at this object suspended above us and gawked. Finally, in my excitement and confusion, I lifted a finger and pointed at the sphere of light, asking, "What is that?" As on cue, this object did something even harder to describe. To put it simply, it just faded out, but that would be ludicrous considering just how it achieved this act. It moved silently in a straight line towards us above our heads, all the while fading from existence. It wasn't so simple as merely fading out like a dimmer switch on a kitchen light. It wrapped the darkness of space around itself and moved and became a shadow, where once it was light. Imagine taking a lit bulb and dragging it across the surface of a pool of black paint, slowly submerging it. Well, that's the best way I can describe it. Did it phase out into another dimension? Who knows? Your guess is as good as mine. I'm just telling you what I saw. Once it had completely phased out, it did a loop and shot incredibly fast all the way back across the bay, where it continued to blink on and off at regular intervals. We sat and watched this for a while, now knowing for sure that it was something extraordinary. Eventually there were two. One would blink on, then the other one. This spectacle went on all night. I fell asleep, watching it out the window. They never came so close again, and in the years we went back to the beach, we never saw anything like it again. Every time I go back, I hope and pray to witness this thing again, promising myself that I will try to communicate instead of being completely flabbergasted. It was clear to me, and the rest of us present, that it was under the control of something intelligent. It wasn't very big, but it was big enough to fit one person in at least. I'll leave up to you to theorize what it could be. About 2 or 3 years ago, I was with some friends in my car outside one of my friends' houses. It was 9 p.m. in wintertime, so quite dark, but it was clear weather. There were 5 of us in the car, myself and a friend in the passenger seat, as well as 3 friends sitting in the middle row of the SUV. We were talking about some random topic when all of a sudden I felt an intense feeling going down my spine, like we were being watched. I turned to face my friend in the passenger seat, and he looked me up at the same time like he had just seen a ghost. I asked him if he too felt like that, and he said yes. None of my other friends in the back seat felt anything. We felt really strange, but ignored it and kept talking. A few minutes later, the feeling returned stronger than before, and once again my friend and I looked at each other at the same time. He looked right past me out the driver's side window, which my back was to, and told me to not turn around. None of my other friends saw anything, but he said there was something out there, and I felt some sort of presence behind me. We took turns describing to each other what we sensed it looked like, but we were for sure both seeing/sensing the same thing. It was pure, white and humanoid, but the details of what we sensed are fuzzy to me. A minute or so later it went away and we were totally spooked. This is where it gets weirder. My friend and I both felt the presence making circles around the car, and we began to both see green glowing circles moving quickly around it. It's hard to explain, but when we couldn't really see them, it was more like knowing they were there. They began to move faster, and we were freaking the hell out. Then, all of a sudden, they vanished. Once again, we both saw/felt these, but nobody in the back did. Then my passenger seat friend and I were leaning back to talk in the middle row, when all of a sudden, on the sidewalk behind the car there was a flash of white light, and a creature sprinted towards us. It was pure white, bipedal, somewhat humanoid, and very tall and lanky. I'm gonna guess it was probably 7 feet tall. It had a horse-shaped head, long, black, thin hair, black eyes and claws. My friend and I in the front screamed simultaneously, started the car and got the hell out of there. Once we were far, far away, we once again took turns describing to each other what we saw, and we both were on the point with each other's descriptions. I took everyone home. Then as I was driving home, I still felt the presence behind me. I couldn't tell if it was in the car or not, but whenever I got to a stop sign, I felt it catching up. So I sped up the rest of the way back. Once I got home, it was gone. Both my friend and I could sense that whatever it was wasn't there to kill us or anything, just to make its presence known. Nothing like it has happened before or since. The only relevant connecting factor between the passenger seat friend and I, that those in the back did not share, is that we were both Christian at the time. Any ideas on what we could have experienced would be greatly appreciated. This story didn't happen to me. It actually happened to my dad. Years ago, when he was about 17, him and his first girlfriend decided to go on a little hike in the forest behind their town. It was rumored that there was a cave at the very end of the forest where it opened up on a small hill. They decided to go together one afternoon as they were bored during summer break. They were going to have a picnic right outside the cave to see if it was real and take a picture on a Polaroid with them in front to prove that they had been to their friends, as a challenge of adolescence. They made their way through the forest and it seemed simple enough. There was nothing really there to stop them making their way, aside from a particularly nasty bush at one point. My dad says that it was very awkward, the conversation between the two, as even though he'd known and liked the girl for a while, he still wasn't really sure what they should be talking about, and she was in the same boat. But nonetheless, they made the best of it, in near silence as they walked along the path. Within about half an hour of walking, they made it to the cave entrance. It was a lot spookier than he had thought. He'd never actually been this far in the forest, and he looked up at the ominous opening in the hill. In order to reach it, they would have to scramble up a small amount of the hill to get to the opening, which is something that she wasn't prepared to do, as she wasn't really wearing appropriate attire that she wanted to get dirty. My dad, on the other hand, felt emboldened by her presence and wanted to explore to appear brave or something, in his words. So, Polaroid at the ready, they snapped a picture with the mouth of the cave perfectly visible in the shot. She told him that she would wait right there, and up he went into the cave to have a little poke around. He said at first, the thing that impacted him the most was the smell. He'd never really been in a cave before, and the stench of damp and rot invaded his nostrils instantly. He pushed through the dark and grimy cave and had a look around the parts he could see. It was a fairly long and open space. He couldn't determine how far it went in, but it had been clear that it was at least partially man-made on the inside, with an effort to excavate a tunnel further back being apparent. How long it had been used for, or disused for, is another matter, but he stared in awe at the cave. Part of him wanted to go forward, willing himself to explore just to see what treasures and or horrors lied further down, but another part of him told him it best not to go. He heeded the side of caution, and after standing there for a good long while, decided it would be best to go back. Right as he was making his way down the scramble of the hill, he felt something push his back. That caused him to fall unceremoniously right near the foot of the girl. He had actually hurt his head pretty badly and wasn't feeling too good. They made haste back towards his parents' house to be seen to. It left a gnarly cut on his forehead, and after a few days when it was healing up, the girl came back to show him the picture that they had taken on their little outing, after it had been shown to all the friends. She was a bit hesitant at first, because she said that some of her friends said they saw something up near the mouth of the cave. It being a Polaroid and a very small picture, and the cave being in the background, it was hard to determine what this small bundle of pixels could be, but to some people, it looked like a face poking out from behind the cave. Whether it was a phantom that pushed my dad, we will never know, but he has long since left the town and has no intention of going back since to find out. A few years back, I went camping with two buddies in the mountains near Lake Tahoe. We hiked about 2 hours with our packs to a small lake and set up camp. All was normal during the day. We made some hot dogs and beans and then stayed up till it was dark and watched the stars. Once it was dark out, we hiked up to the top of a large boulder to get to a vantage point to see the stars over the trees. I recall that there was no moon out that night because we could see the stars so clearly due to the limited ambient light. And so, we're pretty far out there and there's no background noise / light from humans. Once our eyes adjusted, after half an hour or so, we could see all of the stars and even some satellites slowly moving in the sky. So after we'd done stargazing, we head down to our tents set up right by the lake. We have two-person tents for the three of us. My two friends shared one tent, and I was alone in the other one. We set up the tents right next to each other in the same flat spot. I fall asleep pretty easily because I was tired from hiking and exploring all day and because it was so dark. However, it's about 3 or 4 a.m. when I wake up to a rustling on outside of my tent. In my half-asleep daze, I'm not sure if it was just wind or something else, I kept listening and realized that it was something brushing against my tent, and it sounded like animals pushing its nose against the fabric in the tent and sniffing. The sound was coming from the side of my tent, right next to my head, so I can hear it super clearly. At this point my heart is racing, and I'm lying frozen in my sleeping bag hoping that whatever is outside will leave my tent and it'll be over. I think about calling out to my friends in their tent. I don't want to startle / anger whatever is outside, so I decide to just keep lying still and hoping it will leave. My mind is going through every possibility, and then I finally realize what it is. When we had set up our tent earlier in day, there wasn't much flat space, so we placed our tents very close to each other. Evidently they were closer than when my friend was moving his feet in his sleeping bag. They brushed up against his tent, which was right near my head. So all along it was my friend's feet moving around, and there was no animal or person outside. However, the weird stuff doesn't stop there, and I only realized this next part was weird once we had left the next day and I'd gone home. As I lay in my tent and tried to slow my heart after realizing the rustling was my friend, I was looking at the shadows of the trees on the wall of the tent. They reminded me of as a kid, when a car would slowly drive down your street and the headlights through the blinds would cast a shadow that slowly drew across your ceiling. At the time it made sense to me, and I thought it was just like when I was a kid. Considering I had just thought a creature was outside my tent, this seemed like nothing. However, as I mentioned earlier, it was a moonless and dark night. So what could that light have been? It was a very slow drawing light that had the shadows of the trees moving slowly across my tent wall for about 5 minutes. We were far from civilization, so there's no way it was a car or flashlight from a midnight hiker because the light was steady and slow moving. Could it have been a flare in the sky? A comet perhaps? I still don't know what it could have been, but I only realized after I had gotten home and left the campsite. The Okefenokee Swamp is located mostly in South Georgia and partially in North Florida. I'd been going there since I was a kid. My dad and uncle were avid outdoorsmen, and they were always canoeing, hiking, hunting, fishing, etc. And I grew up learning to love the same things. Now, the first thing that came to your mind when I said swamp was alligators, and you would be correct, and this swamp has some of the largest around. It may sound super scary to non-southerners, but the old saying really is true. If you leave them alone, they'll leave you alone. Canoeing slowly down the dark, tea-colored waters, if you pass too close to one, it will quietly sink into the murky depths. He's not coming to get you. You've simply interrupted his sunbathing. As elementary school kids in South Georgia, it was a kind of rite of passage to go to the Okefenokee field trip and be led on a guided tour by Joe. He was a true outdoorsman, extremely knowledgeable, friendly, good with kids, a little strange, but generally regarded as a good guy, a local legend. He would get that boat closer to the big gators than my dad ever let me get. He taught us kids about them. We even got to hear the mating call of some of the males and watch a lot of their behavior up close. He would also show us all the birds, snakes, and other wildlife. The swamp's residents were used to Joe's boat, so they didn't flee when he got close. Great memories. Anyhow, fast forward to my adulthood, and I still have a great love for the outdoors. I'd recently gotten married and was successfully getting my wife and stepdaughter into kayaking, camping, and hiking. I'd broken them in fairly easy. Calm lakes and beautiful crystal clear blue spring-fed Florida waterways. We'd encountered some gators, but the girls had already become comfortable with the fact that they don't want to hurt humans. I decided it was time to go out to the Okefenokee and show them my childhood swamp stomping grounds. We headed out one weekend, kind of on a whim. I hadn't called ahead to reserve a campsite because I assumed that they wouldn't have been busy yet. Well, I was wrong. Every tent camping site was booked. I was pretty visibly bummed out, so I guess the ranger felt sorry for me. She told us to hold on and was going to check one more thing. When she came back, she had some great news. There was a primitive group site available. If you aren't familiar, these are larger sites that are usually for bigger groups like Boy Scouts, usually situated away from the main campground areas. They do not have electricity. We camp 100% primitive all the time, so this wasn't an issue for us. The ranger explained that this particular group site had been closed for 2 seasons due to the road being washed out. They said they had just fixed the road the week before, but hadn't gotten around to relisting the site as available. She offered to sell it to us for a normal fee instead of the group fee. Deal. We pay, and she vaguely showed us on the map how to get to our home for the night. I remember thinking, damn, that's far as hell from the other sites, but it's going to be nice and quiet. While at the office, we learnt that evening there was going to be a ranger-guided night paddle. This particular park inside the Okefenokee is a designated dark sky park, meaning there's very little light pollution. I was already excited about showing my family the stars and Milky Way, so getting out onto the water at night and seeing the skies that way sounded sweet. We decided to sign up for the night paddle and then head off to find our campsites. When we got there, you could tell right away that the area hadn't been used in several years. Overgrown, spiderwebs everywhere, and teeming with the usual wildlife. I kind of prefer things this way, so I don't think twice about it. It was so far from the campgrounds and the main office area, you couldn't hear a single sound of human or vehicle. The area was large, so I walked around a bit to find a good spot to set up. I looked back at my map to try and gauge exactly how this little island was shaped, and noticed what I was seeing and what the map showed didn't quite line up. Whatever, I'm sure I was just reading it wrong. We set up our camp and just enjoyed the sunshine and the sound of nature. It was still very early spring, so the hordes of mosquitoes and various other swamp bugs weren't out yet in full force. The bugs in the swamp in the summer months could be a horror story of themselves, and around 7:30 p.m. we loaded the kayaks back into my pickup and headed all the way across to the park to the launch area, as our guided paddle was supposed to start at 8. We approached the launch area with a good 15 to 20 people going into the paddle. Led by a young, enthusiastic ranger, we all slipped off into the water with our headlamps on the red light setting. We exit the small canal we had been traveling in and emerged out into a larger river-type waterway that meandered through the swamp. As we slowly and quietly crept along, cypress trees draped with Spanish moss loomed over us on both sides, with a dramatic orange and pink sunset as their backdrop. The sun finally began disappearing, and the stars started to come out. It was absolutely stunning, and still one of my favorite kayaking memories. I'd never actually seen the Milky Way like that before. It was a new moon night, dark as it could be. About a mile from our original launch, we all congregated out in the middle of the wide waterway and sat completely still and quiet. The motionless dark waters of the swamp reflected the skies like a mirror. Thousands of stars and galaxies twinkled above us, and below us it was like being in space. Shooting stars were visible every few minutes. It was really magical. The only artificial light in the sky was the dull glow of Jacksonville, Florida on the horizon, which was about 100 miles to our southeast. After a while, the ranger snapped all of us out of our trance. It was time to head back. When we were paddling out there, it had been dusk/twilight for most of the trip. Not much light, but enough to kind of silhouette the trees and branches against the sky, and a slight glimmer on the water. By now it was pitch black, and I do mean pitch black. The ranger told us to switch our headlamps back onto their normal white light setting, so that we could all see well enough to navigate out of the swamp. As each headlamp slowly switched on and the swamp was illuminated, we were met with hundreds of glowing eyes. Hundreds, I swear to you. Now, as I said earlier, I grew up out here. Gators were nothing new nor scary to me at all. However, growing up, we really never stayed out of the water past dark. We would shine our lights out over the water to look at all the eyes, but from dry land, far away from the beasts. Now I found myself and my little family, quite literally, pushing past floating gators with our kayaks. They were absolutely everywhere, all over the sides, all of the channel, as well as blocking our way to the center. The ranger was leading and assured everyone not to worry. He paddled up towards a huge group of shining eyes ahead of us and pushed right through them. Most of the eyes disappeared under the water, but the gator directly in the ranger's path thrashed and his tail hit the kayak. Holy crap. Sharp gasps from the group pierced the otherwise quiet southern night air, but the ranger showed no sign of panic, which was reassuring. We all trusted the young man that we weren't going to really piss them off by kayaking straight into them. As we went along, the sounds of the gators being bumped by kayaks and thrashing were heard every few minutes. There weren't any other jarring sounds or movements, just the constant calling of frogs, cicadas, and the splashing of disturbed dinosaurs. When we finally turned back into the small channel that led to the launch, there were no more glowing eyes. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a bit freaked out, but I can honestly say I wasn't panicking. The ranger being so cool and confident while leading the way made it pretty easy to stay calm. Everyone started to relax again as we neared the launch and got out, loaded our boats, and one by one headed back to our camps. There was a line of red trail lights following off towards the main campground, while my wife, daughter, and myself split off alone into the darkness towards the other side of the park where our site was. I do remember that feeling, kind of eerie, but everyone had made it through the gator gauntlet safely with no problems. Now we were laughing about it and remarking on how cool the whole experience was. We were in high spirits, no stress. We had no idea that the terror would come much later in the night. We got back to our site around midnight, and we were starving. I got a nice fire going while my wife prepped dinner. The meal finished cooking around 1 a.m., and we finally all settled down to get comfy by the fire and eat. But I hadn't taken 2 bites of my food when the horrifying experience began. The cicadas and frogs were singing, but you tend to drown that out in the background because it's so constant. But suddenly, out of the calming buzz of their singing, sprung a sound that I will never forget. A low, rumbling, guttural growl, long and deep, vibrating in our chests. We all froze and looked at each other. Did you hear that? Not 10 seconds later, we heard it again. Yes, we definitely heard it. It sounded close, really close, like on the other side of the bush. The only thing I could honestly relate it to at the time was the growling that a T-Rex makes in Jurassic Park. I was terrified. I've been scared in the woods and the swamps. I've seen swamp gas, freaky creatures, heard screams. I've been in the Marine Corps. I've encountered bears in the Appalachian Mountains. I've explored and experienced all kinds of places. When I tell you, I have never been this scared, I mean it. Pure, raw, primordial fear. I immediately told the girls to get into the cab of my pickup. They get into the truck, and I hop into the bed of the truck with my little .375 Magnum drawn. I figured being back there would get me up off the ground and give me a little advantage over what was coming. I told the girls to lock the doors and open the little sliding back window so that we could communicate. I frantically started shining my flashlight around, aiming my gun along with it. I see absolutely nothing. We continue to hear the growling coming from one general direction, not getting any softer nor louder, just continuously emitting in 3 to 5 second long intervals, every 30 seconds or so. It was coming from the brush right next to our site. I shine my light all over that area but see nothing, just thick palmetto leaves, underbrush and pine, no movement whatsoever. Then, suddenly, we heard the sound coming from the complete opposite direction, more towards the open area of our site. I whip around and shine my light that way, and that's when I noticed the dense fog that had settled onto the entire area. It was a damp, sticky, suffocating fog. Almost right away, the growling sound was coming back from the original direction. I whip around, but immediately I hear it again behind me. That's when I realized there were 2 of them, doing a kind of call and answer to each other. That's also when I realized the other sounds of the swamp had gone silent. Nothing but the call and answer of whatever was making these absolutely gut-wrenching sounds. It got deafeningly quiet for a moment. Nothing but the heavy fog which seemed to have a silent sound of its own. My wife, with shaky, trembling voice, told me she wanted to leave immediately, and that our daughter agreed. Now I was absolutely terrified. Do not misunderstand this. However, the thought of just leaving all of my expensive camping gear behind me was somehow more offensive. Not to mention I was getting kind of frustrated. I'm home in this damn swamp. I know all the creatures here. I'm comfortable here. It's borderline pissing me off that something out there has me so scared and confused. I start trying to rationalize what could be making this sound. Suddenly it started back up again, but now it sounds like there could be 4 or 5 of them, all growling back and forth to each other, overlapping each other, now coming from all sides. A demonic chorus of deep, rattling, soul-sucking rumbles, not getting any closer or further away, just keeping us closely surrounded. If I'd have needed to defecate, believe me, I would have crapped myself. I kept myself at least somewhat cool by affirming that it must be animals of some kind. I wouldn't even entertain the thought of anything supernatural or cryptic. My wife kept saying it sounded like a big cat, and while I agreed I knew it just wasn't, it would have had to have been a massive lion or tiger to make some extremely low rumbling. I racked my brains for the biggest animal it could be and kept landing on alligator. Yet we had just paddled directly through an entire swarm of them, some of them absolutely massive, and they hadn't made a single sound the whole time we were out on the water. No, that couldn't be it. I even had a thought that the young, playful ranger had orchestrated some kind of practical joke on us poor campers out here all alone. Really and truly, I had no idea what it was, and not being able to even see a glimpse so I could take a shot at it to protect my family was a very helpless feeling. I really wish I had more words for how it felt, just blindly standing in the back of that truck, hearing what I could only imagine were the scariest, evilest, most vile things on the planet, just knowing that they wanted to kill, eat, or otherwise mutilate myself and my family. It felt like an eternity, but we'd probably only been holed up in the truck for 10 to 15 minutes at this point. It had finally gone quiet again, and I told the girls that we could leave, but I'm not leaving the gear. I climbed into the cab and started the truck and moved it, positioned it to where I could shine the headlights on our stuff and packed it all up, gun in hand. I began rolling up the tent, gathering all of our stuff and throwing it into the bed of the truck, praying nothing crazy happened, like my truck dying, or some other perfectly timed cinematic horror moment. I tried to put on a confident air as to not scare my family, but in my head I felt so vulnerable, like I was something's prey. The growling still hadn't returned, but honestly the silence was freaking me out more than anything. And the fog. I'll never forget how oppressive that fog felt. All of our gear was sopping wet with it, and I swear it was just hard to breathe the air. The fire was nothing but a smolder, despite the fact it had been roaring bright 20 minutes ago. Just as I was rolling up the very last sleeping mat, one final, closer than before growl shook me to my core. I snatched that mat up and took off running, getting to the truck, Duke of Hazzard style, and taking the hell off. None of us looked back. When we finally got back home, I had a browse on YouTube, and I heard something that made my skin crawl. It was the sound that large male alligators made while mating. The louder, slower, and scarier sounding, the more the female gator finds it attractive. Those must have been the swamp's sexiest alligators, because I had never heard this sound in all my life. I had been under the impression that I knew what their mating calls sounded like from my childhood experiences in the Okefenokee Joe's boat and my father and uncle. These gators must have been absolutely massive to produce the sounds we were hearing, because it was nothing like what you ever heard in the swamp. It was like what I saw in that video. But I'm telling you, in person, you can physically feel it rattling your insides. Though I was somewhat comforted by the fact that the noises were just gators flirting, and they weren't being aggressive towards us, my wife and daughter, still think we were in danger, because we were close. I'm not too sure about that part. I got into Google Maps and tried to figure out exactly where we'd been camping, because from looking at the map the ranger had given us, we shouldn't have been that close to the water. I never could quite figure it out where we ended up. I don't know if it was us being in the wrong place, or the fact the area hadn't had any human activity for 2 years, or a combination of both, that put us so close to all of this mating activity that would normally not happen in areas with lots of humans. Either way, it made for a heart-pounding experience that we still talk about to this day. Also, as a funny addition to the story, looking back, the most hilarious thing was that my daughter was eating corn on the cob at the time when we heard the first sound, and it was still in her hands. So during the entire event of being terrified and hearing these growls, she had a corn on the cob in her hand. I can assure you though, that the fear and adrenaline in the moment were very real. Imagine hearing that sound in the pitch darkness of the night in the Okefenokee swamp and not knowing what it was. Looking back, I suppose the fog settling in on us at the exact moment the growling started was just kind of a coincidence, but it did make the whole experience much scarier. I will never forget that particular kind of fear that I experienced that night. I recently caught the beaver fever from beavers. My old employer needed a beaver dam gone, called an excavator to rip it to shreds, and in 48 hours those industrial little beavers built it back and better than before. Not wanting to continually waste money on an excavator, I was sent down there with our gator and an Amazon grappling hook with the idea that if we keep pissing them off, maybe they'll just leave. I'm a wilderness and first response trained person and knew that I was playing with fire, but I figured I'd be fine with chest-high waters and the knowledge to be wary. The second day of ripping it up, the grappling hook slipped and flung mud and water in my direction, and I caught a pea-sized chunk of mud on the corner of my mouth. I did my best to wash my face off with my water bottle and kept my mouth firmly shut, and immediately drove back to the office to rinse my face with hydrogen peroxide and gargled mouthwash. 2 days later, and boom, my new residence was the porcelain throne. I went to GI and took tests, and when I got a call from the office a few days later, I was informed that I had Giardia. The nice lady tried to explain how most people in urbanish areas who contact it via being unhygienic. I guess the doctor didn't really relay my story properly, but she had quite the surprise when I said, "Nope, I know exactly how it happened, and yes, I do wash my hands after I go to the toilet." I didn't wish that on my worst enemy, or maybe I would. Those were the worst 3 weeks of my life. I lost 20 pounds and am already an extremely slender guy, averaged about 3 hours of sleep a night, and couldn't stomach anything, and was in one of the worst mental states I've ever experienced. Thing to take away from this story? Don't piss off beavers in the woods. Let me preface this by stating that almost all of the encounters that I have witnessed have been with at least one other individual. The first two encounters happened on 2 consecutive days in 1997, and the numerous other encounters happened over the span of 90 days and a year and a half. I don't recall being abducted, but I have filled in reports with the incredibly incompetent MUFON. Back in 97, my buddy and I had just finished up our shifts at a pizza joint. It was 11 PM and we were worn out and wanted to get stoned. We were completely sober. We drove out into a cornfield in the off year, so it was full of rye. We were about half a mile off the road and it was pitch black, and because of our vantage point, I could see headlights in any direction for a good mile. We were way out in the country, so no worries. My buddy starts breaking up the weed, when I notice what I believe to be truck headlights shine directly from behind, take a hard left, and disappear. My buddy didn't seem to notice, but I became frantic because I thought it was the cops. My friend thinks I'm messing with him and continues breaking up some really terrible brick weed. I recall looking at the stars, and one star in particular grabbed my attention. I can't tell you why, but it looked like your average star. Within 30 seconds, this star starts moving up and down, side to side and in circles, and I yelled in panic, "What the hell?" My buddy gives a dismissive sigh, and when he looks where I'm pointing for 5 minutes, the UFO continues to move in very fluid movements, making impossible maneuvers, and doing so in complete silence. Without notice, this one object becomes 5 equally impressive star-like objects. They stayed close together. At times they moved in some sort of formation. The other times they seemed to move independently. Just as quick as the 5 came, they fused back together as one. We were in shock, but we didn't feel like we were in harm's way. We were recapping what we had just witnessed, but that single UFO was still there. It wasn't moving much. We thought things were coming to a close, but we were wrong. This time, the one object turned into at least 7. The thing, the way moved and jerked around, felt aggressive. My friend must have felt the same way, because he said he was starting to get nervous. I told him we should go, and I embarrassingly confessed that I knew it was there for us, and I became fearful. We haul out of there, and this thing follows us till the outskirts of town. The night after, me and the same buddy walked across to my apartment complex to go visit a neighbor that was about to grill some burgers. The sun was just starting to set on a humid midsummer afternoon. We knock on the door, and my neighbor lets us in. With him was his girlfriend, her sister, and some random guy that I didn't know. I go out back to chat with Ray, while he fires up the Kingsford. It's the two of us, so I take the opportunity to tell him about the previous night. The stars are just starting to come out, and in my storytelling I pointed one out just so Ray would know exactly what I meant. I'm still pretty much tripped out, so I'm fairly excited while describing everything. I'm almost done with my story, and I notice Ray looking at the stars that are just beginning to appear. I mean, this guy is looking around everywhere. It's like he became instantly paranoid. While I was in mid-sentence, Ray points to the northeast and yells, like that, right there. Holy crap. The goosebumps. He yelled inside for everyone to come out, so they did. And soon after, the same situation as mentioned above began to occur. That went on for a bit. It went on for so long that everyone but Ray and myself went inside. We ate our burgers while watching this, and behind Ray's apartment was a field. 300 yards away on the other side of the field is a tree line and a creek. On the other side of that tree line is another field. The object slowly descends towards the tree line, and I open the door and yell for everyone to come back out. We watch this huge, fiery orb in complete silence land on the other side of the tree line. When we lost direct sight of it, we could still see the light through the trees. Right before the light disappeared, it became very bright. We all kept asking each other if it was real. And this is the part where I may lose some of you. But after several minutes, at the end of all the sunlight, nothing was happening. Everyone was in and out the house. I remember standing in front of the back door talking to Ray's girlfriend in the kitchen. Ray, my buddy from the previous night, and the girlfriend's sister were outside. My buddy just goes, "Oh crap," under his breath and darts past me. The sister is right behind him. Ray shoves me into the door and almost falls on top of me. The girlfriend screams, slams the door shut and locks it. We all back away from the door. After our collective "what the hell was that?", we decided it was 4 legs covered in brown fur and trying to attack us. This apartment was a townhouse. We all went upstairs to get a better look, and there it was in the shadows. It was pacing around and keeping an eye on us. This is when they appeared. They came out of the darkness. They were short, about 3 feet. The skin tone was greyish, with a bit of Caucasian colour. They were sort of greys. There were several of them. Meanwhile, the animal thing starts climbing a utility pole. This isn't your standard utility pole. It has 6 to 8 transformers on it, and is 8-shaped, and kind of low. When the beast starts to climb, I watch it change to a degree. It decides to perch on one of those crossbeams and look right at us, but it focused seemed to be on the other creatures. It acted like a guard dog, for lack of better words. The greys were clothed but had some sort of instruments. They seemed preoccupied by the field. They would look at us on occasion, but they were doing something else. What exactly, I don't know. This went on for hours. Eventually we all went back down the stairs, and every once in a while I would go to check to see if they were gone. As soon as it was all clear, I ran home. That was it. For the next 4 years I pretty much believed it was random. And then after meeting my biological father for the first time, my now ex-wife jokingly brings up my UFO stories over dinner and wine. And that's a whole nother can of worms I don't want to get into now. I recently drove home from school to work for the summer before going back, and I haven't been up only to the National Forest, which is in Wisconsin, about 5 hours from my house. I took a friend along and we left this Saturday at around 10 AM and got there at 3:30 PM because the forest roads were pretty bad. The mosquitoes at this time of year are absolutely horrible, and the headwater wilderness is mostly swamp and marsh, so we hiked around for about 5 miles before finding a campsite down an abandoned but marked forest road that led to private property 4 miles in. The private property has no access, but I saw that it was not a part of the federal land on my GAIA GPS app. The road was extremely overgrown, with large ostrich ferns on the entire path, down-limbed every half a mile or so, and plenty of dead wood to support a fire. We had set our packs about a mile back, and were just exploring down it further in hopes to find something cooler than the essentially solo beech forest that we had found. When it started getting dark, we decided to turn around, and when circumnavigating a downed tree, we found a small collection of branches and twigs bundled together in a sort of shrine shelter. A full, 3-foot-tall shelter that had obviously taken a decent amount of time to build. It looked like it had a full interior of sticks too. I'm slightly superstitious, so I recognized this potential for it to be a Nissi or something similar, and we found some good wood to leave it as an offering and went on our way. Later that night our fire reignited, and we had to use a full gallon to douse it with no wind. I heard footsteps around our tent after my friend had used the restroom and gone back inside his tent. I heard what sounded like a log smack the base of a tree in a 1-2-3 pattern every 5 minutes, and I swear I heard a little sounding voice or giggle as I was trying to get to sleep. Needless to say, I got out of there in the morning. Nothing nefarious really happened though, so I'm not sure if it was just my imagination or some cryptid being mischievous with us because we didn't leave them a good enough offering. What do you guys think this could have been? My partner was at a bachelorette party at a campground. She is a 22-year-old female. I was not invited for reasons of being male. The audacity, I know, but I stayed up late in case anything happened. She called me at midnight, panicked, saying he was just in here, and I had her recount everything after taking a few breaths. This is her story. After a fun day and night of drinking, playing games, hiking and swimming, they decide to call it a night. We will call my partner Mindy for anonymity. Well, Mindy decided to finally take a shower after everyone else was turning in and walked to the camp bathrooms. She noticed an older white male sitting on a bench, but he doesn't pay her any mind, listening to something on his phone. She assumed that he was waiting for someone or just sitting on a bench at night, as the campgrounds are full of strangers. It's one of the kind of showers where you need to push the button to get the water to go. So her shower was very short, and she had brought her clothes, so she got dressed too. She heard someone else and assumed another person needed to use the shower, and as she opened the curtain, she saw the man peeking into the shower stalls one at a time. She was the only person in there, and all she could do was stand there, mouth agape, staring at the man. He realized someone was standing there, and when he saw her, his eyes got super wide and he sprinted away. I told her that the ranger or camp staff should be nearby and to let them know immediately, or the police, but since she was at someone else's celebration, she didn't want to disturb anything. I figured there was some shock and didn't want to raise her anxiety by arguing. Still, neither of us slept that night, as I waited for her call and she waited for a man to break into her tent. She tells the rangers the next morning, and they say, "We've gotten several reports yesterday about this man, but no one can seem to find him," flabbergasted that the man had once again caused discomfort. It seems to me that he was trying to muster courage to potentially do something worse, and it was a whole day of stalking, hiding and watching and waiting, sneaking into shower stalls, but that he was still timid. I'm just glad she came home safely, as I really wish I were there to have given the guy a piece of my mind. This event occurred in early fall 1971. I grew up in the Philly suburbs. The Boy Scouts were popular then, and I was quite active, especially with camping. One of the go-to areas was the New Jersey Pine Barrens, especially along the Wading River and Bass River State Forest. On to the man. Our patrol was on a weekend camping trip at the South Shore Campground. Lots of pine breaks, but even more swamps and bogs, and boggy swamps. Our patrol, probably 7 of us plus one guy's dad who drove us, was assigned a 3-sided shelter. The front of the shelter opened to the swamp. If you walked 11 feet from the front, you'd be standing in ankle-deep water, and then it just got deeper and darker and boggier. We mucked around Saturday until late afternoon, made our way back to the shelter, cooked dinner and chilled until it got dark. And it was crazy dark. No other campers around, and just the light of our slowly dying fire illuminated our space. We began to hear a slow splashing sound coming from the swamp, maybe 100 feet from our fire. One of the guys yelled something towards the sound and everything went quiet. A minute later the splashing began again, but slower and more methodical. By this time it was within 15 feet of the fire, but it was out of the fire's light. Here's what our vibe was. None of us were concerned. We were all seasoned campers and figured it was a deer or raccoon looking to score an easy meal. Suddenly the walking became a slow, steady sloshing. This perked us up, wondering if this thing may suddenly decide to rush us. Our patrol leader jumped up, grabbed his flashlight and pointed it towards the noise. His light hit something and he yelled out, "It's a man!" and ran to the swamp berm. I saw a brief flash of red flannel in the flashlight beam and then heard a fast splashing back into the swamp. The splashing eventually faded out into the darkness. So what did we do? Try to figure out what the hell just happened, then crawled into our sleeping bags and fell asleep? Well, nothing else happened, and we went home the next day as scheduled. Thinking back on this now, it must have been a local piney who knew the area well. The man had to navigate through some serious and dangerous swamps to check us out. The pines have a great and eerie vibes, and that weekend held both for us. A friend of mine was a hunter who shared with me this story. He was bow hunting and stalking a deer in the woods during hunting season. At that moment he was silently, slowly working his way towards the deer. Then, all the hair on the back of his neck went up. He turned and realized a mountain lion was stalking him. He was prepared for a hunt, and so was the mountain lion. It pounced. He loosed an arrow. Normally, killing the mountain lion in this area is a big no-no, but his arrow hit it in the mouth and did not chip a tooth, i.e. the lion was attacking with its mouth open. Being a guide, he notified the Department of Fish and Game, and they investigated, but not for long. Pretty clear self-defense, but damn, my friend was moments away from maybe being killed. Back during high school, I had insomnia, so most nights I would occupy my time by playing video games or browsing the web, but usually I would try and lay in bed to get to sleep, while progressively getting more frustrated. I will mention here that my bedroom was separate from the rest of the house. It was actually an under-house storage area that was a single large room with 2 big glass sliding doors and a sheet pinned up for my privacy. Now this particular night, I get the usual feeling it's going to be a long and frustrating night. I'm wide awake, so I start to plan out my school assignments just after 11 p.m. to pass the time, while sitting on my bed doing so. It is here that my memory of the night before the events stops. Next thing I remember is waking up groggily and slowly, on a flat stainless steel looking table, like a surgical slab, naked. I look to my left and there's a blonde girl about my age laying on an identical table next to me, also naked, with 2 beings standing at the foot of the table monitoring her. I was slowly regaining my senses and taking in details around me, like how the room was really bright, but there was no clear light source. The walls were white and had shelves of tools and utensils, a single door at the end of the room. The beings were taller than the average human and thinner. They were wearing what I could describe as a mix between a white lab coat and a blue medical scrub, as well as a face mask. Their eyes and hands were the only true features I could actually see. Their eyes were big and almost almond-shaped, but nowhere near as exaggerated as the commonly depicted grey alien. Their hands were withered and had long fingers, pale in colour. It was only after a few seconds I regained consciousness that the two beings were alerted to me waking. At this moment, one of them rushed to my right side and the other moved to my left, while a third, who appeared to be their superior, walked through the door and at the end of the room to the foot of the table I was laying on. It turned to face the one on the left and spoke something that I couldn't understand, not only because it was in another language, but my hearing was muffled. I looked over to the one on my left, and it had grabbed a syringe-like device and was moving closer towards me, and I blacked out. Next thing I knew, I sat up as quickly as I could in a cold sweat, heart racing and in bed with my assignment work on my desk. I looked at the clock and it was just before 4 a.m. I turned the light on and checked my arm, and there were no bruises or scarring, but I wrote down as much as I could before I forgot. I retold this story to a select few people that I trusted for a few weeks, and one of them asked, "If there were no marks on your arm, what about your side?" Not expecting to see anything, I pointed to a place on my side next to where my elbow falls, saying, "Then there should be something around here." I lifted up my shirt and found a small scar about half an inch in length right between two ribs. Needless to say, we flipped out and proceeded to poke around with it for the next hour. I was rock climbing with two other guys in Colorado and was belaying one of them when the two of us on the ground heard something weird. The commands we use to communicate that we are safe at the top of the route are name of guy on the ground, off belay, which prompts the belayer to unclip the rope from his belay device so the climber can pull slack out of the rope. The response to that command is name of the guy at the top of the route, belay off. The climber was approximately 40 meters up on a 50-meter route. I didn't know this at the time. The rope stopped moving, which isn't uncommon when someone is having a hard time with a move, or is setting up an anchor, which is what I thought was going on when we heard it. A voice that sounded way closer to the ground, like close enough that we could have had a shouting conversation, and way further left off the route, where the climb should have started. It said, "Tommy Sticks off belay." I looked at the other guy in our climbing party who was just as confused as I was. He said to me, "What the hell was that?" And we discussed where the climber should be at the time and that we should not be able to hear him that well. The rope still wasn't moving, and I decided to keep him on belay. I figured it would be best to just keep him safe and feed slack through my belay device, in the event that this wasn't him. Turns out it wasn't. A few moments later the rope starts moving again, followed by a faint syllable counted "Tommy Sticks off belay" that sounded way more like it should have. We didn't think anything of it, but we had been travelling down the wall and hit a few routes without seeing anyone. We also had a few friends just a few months ago that burned in on a route when someone took him off belay when he wasn't safe. I remember seeing a video of a hiker walking down the road when he hears a voice of a woman calling him off the road. The guy stops trying to figure out what's going on, then just gets out of there because of how weird it was. I don't know what kind of creature would be mimicking a person out in the middle of nowhere, but any advice would be greatly appreciated. I'm a 27-year-old female, and I went backpacking alone over the recent long weekend, which was beautiful. The second night, I camped at a beautiful high-elevation lake, which could also be accessed by a short 1-mile trail. So there were a few other campers and several people who were just day hiking or fishing. It was late afternoon, and I was sitting around my camp reading, when a guy in his mid-20s walked by carrying a fishing pole and a small cooler. I didn't think much of it, but 5 to 10 minutes later, he doubled back and came to say hi. I said hi and went back to reading, but then without warning, he then sat down on a stump next to me. I was completely taken aback at this invasion of my space, and he started asking me questions that were really just statements, but in a creepy, amused tone like, "So you're just reading?" And then looked behind me and noticed my tent and said, "Oh, you're staying the night here alone, huh?" I didn't say anything in response to this in particular, but it's obvious that I am. It's hard to explain, but his vibe was really off. I was so uncomfortable that I really couldn't form words or tell him I was trying to be alone and to leave. I was honestly paralyzed. His eyes were so dead and dark and just drilling into me. I just responded with like, "Uh-huh," or "Yep," or something to just try and pretend I was still reading. Without warning, he pulls out and cracks a beer and lights a cigarette and just starts blowing it at me. At this point, I'm so uncomfortable and just not responding. Soon after, another hiker wanders by, and he strikes up a conversation with him, and I took the opportunity to grab my water filter and bladder and pretend I needed to go get water. I went to the shore, filtered some water super slowly, and saw him walk away and go sit with the new guy, which made me relieved, except that he kept looking in my direction. I came back eventually and got inside my tent, and for about 20 minutes everything was fine. I had the rainfly pulled back and was watching the sunset and loosely organizing my things when he popped out from behind my tent and stood maybe 1 foot from my door looking down at me. He didn't even say anything. He was just staring and began laughing very creepily. I asked him what, and his response was, "This is just really funny." I felt sick to my stomach and finally responded with, "I'm taking a nap now. Have a good night." He laughed again and left. Later I saw him wandering around camp with no real purpose, still looking in my direction often. I had no service, but I wrote down his last name, at least what was written on his cooler, and where he said he was from while talking to the other hikers in my notes app, just in case, and slept with a pocket knife close. I debated leaving camp that night, but ended up staying and just leaving super early in the morning, in case he came back. Normally, while backpacking, I think the worst thing that could happen is that I might run into a bear or sprain an ankle, and maybe this seems not as bad as you reading it, but this truly was the most unsettling experience I've ever had in the backcountry. I'm sure I'll be back out soon, but hopefully it'll be somewhere far away from this dude. I was in Wisconsin in the summer of 2017 with my buddies on a week-long camping trip for Boy Scouts. It was pretty moderate weather, as it usually is up there in the summer, so we slept in our hammocks, in a group of trees next to each other away from the rest of our troop. The third night into the trip, we woke up at around 1 in the morning at the exact same time. One of my friends just said, "Screw it, let's go for a hike," and we all agreed. We didn't know the area, but we made sure we knew our way back. We were about 20 minutes in when we approached a clearing, and right as we did, everything went silent. Wisconsin has so many insects in the summer, and they are very loud. And then suddenly, there was nothing. The crunching of leaves under our feet was also gone. Then the shadows in the clearing started to look like they were growing and coming towards us, and I felt as if we were in danger. We're all track guys, so we absolutely book it back in about 4 minutes. None of us slept that night, and we all came to the consensus that we all saw shadows coming towards us, had all the sounds go out, and felt danger coming. We still speak about that night sometimes when we get high, and it sends shivers down my spine. I'm very educated in my religion, and still cannot correlate that to my religion, but I'm currently going over it with a scholar I respect. It scared me so much it was actually scarier than when I found a whole abandoned meth lab in Missouri, complete with hacksaws hanging from a tree. I grew up in rural Arkansas. I lived right on the edge of town at one point, and a buddy's house was a few miles away. The quickest way to get there was walking along the train tracks. So I'm walking to his house one night and it's dark, like dark. Wasn't a moon out or anything on either side for a good while but dense wood. It's not unusual to hear things running around, and for the most part they're harmless. But when it's pitch dark in the middle of the night, you don't think, harmless. I'm crunching along on the gravel when I hear something crashing through the woods off to my left. I stop walking to listen, and it stops for a moment. I start walking along again, and something starts rushing through the brush, and I hear it crunch through the gravel right in front of me, and stop to what sounds like a few feet away. I froze, and I'm just trying to see anything, when I hear a loud snort, and it crunches off into the woods again. An hour later, while I'm sitting in the house with the lights on everywhere, I thought about how I wish it was daylight so that I could see how close the deer came near me. At the time, all I could think of was, this is it. This is how I die. Some horrible monster is about to drag me into the woods and eat me. My wife and I live in the Seattle area. Since the climate is colder here, centralized air conditioning is a luxury reserved for the wealthy. The rest of us have to sweat it out in the summer when it gets hot. We were living in a triplex apartment on the second floor, and it got baked by the sun all day, so it would be uncomfortably hot well into the night, and we usually had all the windows open and fans blasting. We felt safe sleeping with the windows open, on account of being the second floor. The really weird thing happened in the summer of 2013, during one of the hottest weeks of the year. I was up late, as was my habit, playing video games or something, when I went to bed around 1 a.m. I walked into our bedroom and started crawling into bed when I noticed a shining orb just chilling right outside our open window. It was just hovering there, bobbing up and down like a ball does when it hits water. I hadn't been drinking, and I'd never done any hallucinogenic drugs, so I was convinced what I was seeing was real. All of a sudden the orb kind of turns, and I see what looks like a camera aperture facing me, almost like the eyeball thing that comes out of the door of Jabba's place when Luke goes to rescue Han. Then it flashes at me several times. Just as soon as it appears, I watch it zip off. When I stuck my head out the window to see where it went, it was gone. I was seriously freaked out, but I was also exhausted from the heat, so I just went to bed. But I've never told anyone except my wife about this, and she believed me. I didn't seem as disturbed by the occurrence as I was. This was pretty early in the era of consumer drones, and they weren't that advanced at that point. My best guess was that it was some kind of secret government surveillance tool. If that is the case, some CIA agent somewhere has a few pictures of me looking very dumbfounded in my underwear. Anyone else ever see anything like this? Or know what it was? Perhaps it was that. Or maybe something otherworldly. Around 10 to 15 years ago, me and a friend were driving down River Road when some winged creature swoops the hood of my car, surrounding and blocking both the windshield and wrapping around the passenger and driver's side windows and then vanishing. As we're driving, I'm telling her this story about this sleep paralysis demon I saw in a dream. It looked like a winged demon made of molten stone with red eyes, trapped behind a stone prison that it escapes and chases me. It's dark out, maybe 9 p.m, and as I'm telling this story, we drive under a large willow tree, and something drops out of the sky or tree and swoops the hood of my car, filling my entire windshield, wrapping around to the side windows with wings. My friend screams and I stop the car. I remember it now as an owl with feathery wings, but part of me remembers red eyes, black fleshy wings and a human face, but I'm unsure if that was just because of the images that were already running around in my head as I was telling the story. There are owls where we were, so I was wondering if maybe that was something owls do, swoop headlights or something, but there are no owls that would be large enough to explain what I saw. Just barn owls, and I've seen them before. I thought I'd ask around in case anyone has ever experienced something similar like this, as it's always bothered me, and my friend is sick of me asking her what she remembers. She just said it was weird, and she was too scared and closed her eyes. Has anyone else ever heard or had this happen to them? I'd love to hear from you. We had the nice idea of camping on the beach, instead of going to a hotel, since I always wanted to sleep and hear the waves hitting the shore, see the night sky whenever I wanted, and just to live the experience at least once in my life. We were supposed to stay in our tent for a week. The area had public restrooms with showers and restaurants, so the matter of hygiene and hunger were not an issue. We brought all the supplies we needed for such an adventure: a 2-person tent, which was blacked out, an inflatable mattress, first aid kit, lanterns for the tent, etc. The first night were no issue. We actually enjoyed every moment of it. We would always take all our valuables with us in a backpack, in case anything bad would happen to our tent: phones, chargers, wallets, etc. We weren't the only people that camped in the area. There were plenty of people that would camp there, either single people, couples, or even families, which included even people that behaved badly. When night came, you would occasionally hear people laughing, partying, dancing, listening to music, or smoking, taking drugs, or drinking copious amounts of alcohol. We didn't mind, as nobody had bothered anyone for the past 4 days. People were having fun, and they knew best, and no one was being aggressive at that point. Well, one night we stayed out later than normal, around 1 a.m, and just wandering around the lively streets to listen to street performers eating out and such, when we stopped at one of such street performers who seemed to have a lot of people circling him and listening to his music, when we realized he wasn't the main character the people were gathered for. In the middle of the crowded street, where cars would occasionally pass by, was a middle-aged woman, dancing completely naked, clearly affected by the abuse of alcohol and/or drugs. She was incoherent. She would randomly flirt with people and would expose herself while dancing to the music, despite the disgust of the musician and the passers-by. We didn't look much into it, and decided to leave back to our tent and just have a drink in silence while watching the stars and fall asleep to the sounds of the ocean. While drinking ourselves, we hear some ladies shouting in the distance. It's the same woman we had seen before, but she was not alone. She had friends with her, 2 women and 2 men. They had set up camp on the same beach as us, a few tents further away, but not far enough so that we couldn't see nor hear them, even if it was dark. They lit a fire on the beach and continued to drink, smoke, and dance all around it. She, of course, was still naked, but this time she was wearing a see-through skirt. She goes in the ocean for what seems like an eternity, and I remember thinking to myself, how isn't she cold? The water must have been freezing. My boyfriend just shrugged it off and told me not to be bothered. If we don't engage with her, then they wouldn't annoy us. So I did as I was told, but even so, I always felt like I was being watched. I put my thoughts aside and just decided to go to sleep. But being a beautiful night and the air warm, we thought of not closing the tent completely, just zip the mosquito cover so the air would circulate inside the tent and have the sun shine in the morning to wake us up early. I didn't recall how long I'd been sleeping for, but I remember being awoken by footsteps circling around our tent and a womanly voice humming a song softly. The tent was not very thick. You could hear everything outside of it. I was too afraid to look out. Heck, I was too afraid to even change my position as to not indicate to the outsider that I noticed their presence. All I did was lay down and look outside through the mosquito cover. All of a sudden I hear the footsteps stop above my head and the voice whisper, "Don't be afraid, I only want to sing you a lullaby." And the footsteps began again to circle the tent. I see her feet in front of the tent pass by, noticing the very familiar long see-through skirt blowing behind her. Next morning, we packed our tent and moved to a different area of the beach, further away from that woman and her friends. I'm a 24-year-old male and have been backpacking my whole life, and am very comfortable in secluded places. About a year ago, I went on a 2-night trip with some friends in southwest US. We arrived at a trailhead late afternoon and decided to camp about a quarter of a mile up the trail at a small area with around 3 tents. Next to our site was a barren stream with a small hill at the top, and you could see the silhouettes of a little cottage. After setting up and eating dinner, We cracked a few cold ones and sat around the fire as per usual. A little time passed, and we hear some activity coming from where the cabin is. At first it was just the chatter of voices, but it soon changed to some sort of group laughter, almost as a chant. It was a very forced laugh with several people in unison, which lasted maybe 5 to 10 seconds. Pause, and again. At first we assumed someone cracked a good joke at the cabin, but after about 30 minutes or so it became very weird. At this point, it's quite late, probably around 11 p.m, and we decided we had to find out what was going on. We crept across the barren river and up the hill almost to the crest, where we peered over. We were able to make out about 20 people sitting in a circle, laughing in rhythm with one another. I want to make it clear it was a very creepy laugh, not a natural type, more of a ho ho ho. Anyway, we head back to our site and write it off as some weird stuff, probably nothing to be worried about. Before sleeping, we went down to where we parked and sparked up a joint. Out of the woods come 2 guys, seemingly from the direction the cabin was in. One of them goes, "Hey, were you guys at the cabin up there?" And the individuals respond with, "Yup." My friend continues, "What are you guys doing up there?" "It was a Native American celebration of the full moon." It's not a full moon. Finally, my friend asks, "How do you get involved with that?" "You sign up online. Costs $50 and includes dinner." The 2 individuals drove off as we returned to our campsite laughing about the whole situation. All in all, it was definitely a bit strange, but I'm glad it was nothing serious or sinister. Back in 2001, my family, grandparents, uncle, my parents all lived on a ranch south of Oregon by some big hills. This all happened at night when my brother Bob, who was 12, was playing on the old classic PS2, when my brother said something to him to look to the stars, and he did. He walked over and looked. When he did, he said there was a star that looked to be at the same height as a 747 flies, when it started flashing and shot down towards our backyard. He saw a disc that looked like it was going to land on its side. He later guessed it flies belly first, but when it landed, things got strange. A little background. We had a basement which you could get into from the side very easily, but the door going in and out of the house was locked up tight. My brother and I shared a room next to that door anyway. My brother said he didn't know how they got out of the ship, but when they did, they were tall, skinny, and had a look of pure anger on their faces. As they walked closer to the house, my brother ran to grab me off the top bunk and hid me under a pile of random stuff, and I guess I passed out. The thing at this point was looking into the room, and my brother freaked out and was scared. Understandably so, but I assume we all lost time somewhere, and my dad shows up asking what's going on. Bob explained what happened. Then my dad asked, "Where is your brother?" And my brother said, "I hit him." But my dad freaked out because he thought he had hit me. My dad later told us that it was weird because the basement door was wide open and the ground where that thing landed was dead for years. I don't know what happened, if they took me or my brother, but ever since life has been just a bit more strange. My brother still dreams of them, like they're trying to tell him something. Just a few days ago he told me he had a dream where the TV is static with a symbol on it and then standing in the closet looking at him. His wife said this TV static was a real thing and then it turned itself off. The other is my personal experience. I had borrowed my mum's phone when mine was broken and it was around 2 a.m. So I snuck into her room to put it on the charger. When I looked over, I see this dark skinny shadow with long pointy fingers seemingly sitting up out of my father, looking straight ahead. When it snapped its head towards me, and I ran like a girl. Now, I know you may be thinking that it was a ghost or demon, but when I told my brother the story, he was like, "You just described what came out of that ship that night." This happened in 2004. It's 3-something in the morning, and my family and I are preparing for a road trip to the Grand Canyon. We live in SoCal, and everything is getting packed away in the kitchen, and I'm asked to take out the garbage. I walk outside. It's the kind of dark that when it's too early for morning still, but too late for night, and freakishly quiet. I thought nothing of it at the time. Our trash cans were located on the side of the house in the backyard halfway to the gate. If you stood at the side of my house looking towards the gate, you would see a hedge to the left of the gate that goes up to your waist. Across the street is another house with a driveway light installed. The light gives off that blaring white security light. I get to the trash can, throw away the junk when I look over towards the gate. That's when I saw it, whatever it was. I could only see the outline of it because the blaring white security light was in my eyes, but it was the most smooth and round head I've ever seen, which connected to a very slouched shoulders. At first, I didn't know what I was looking at, just an odd shape, the same height of the hedges. It wasn't until it moved silently and slowly towards the bottom of the hedge at the neighbour's yard that I saw it looked headish. I was 14 at the time and just stood there waiting for more movement or sound. After about 1 minute of not hearing anything, I stepped back until I was able to sprint back towards the kitchen door. I don't know what it was or why it moved so silently, but it wasn't much longer before we moved out of that house due to strange things. I live in North San Diego County, and with the heavy military presence in the environs, sightings of a UFO is a pretty common phenomenon. That said, my wife and I saw a UFO. We still talk about it due to not understanding what exactly we witnessed. We had just put our 2 children to bed and were outside during the summer, just sitting and taking in the night. A light in the sky to the east of us. We live near the ocean, and inland is mainly mountainous desert, so the further you go yonder appeared static and in place. It didn't move, it hovered. We couldn't tell how far away it was. Sometimes it appeared to be off in the distance, and the next instant it appeared to be clearly closer. We both remarked of the properties of whatever we were seeing. After a minute or so, the light, which here therefore could have been a trick of the eyes, and an aircraft or some sort, did impossible moves in the air. It moved faster than any aircraft I've ever seen or heard. It moved at angles while at speed that I know to be impossible given the current state of our technology, and it didn't observe the same concepts of time. For example, as we watched it, it went from a staticky light in the sky to one that seemed to catch on to our wonder about it, and it sped towards us, seemingly fixated on our wonder, past us and was gone. We were both spooked, and my wife and I remarked that we had just seen something pretty incredible in the original sense of the word. I concurred. Not a report of the occurrence the next day in the press, so that we began to wonder if we'd just succumbed to a joint hallucination based on whatever. I've spoken the truth here. Neither my wife or I is especially gullible, though I, for one, have my shameful moments of such. Each of us is at a loss to what we witnessed, but we are cool with having witnessed whatever it was that we saw. Near where I live, there are some woods. It also has some small creeks, about 3 or 4, and is a place where kids go down to ride their bikes and hang out. Well, it was here that I had a very strange encounter, one day around 4 p.m. when I took my dog Bertha for our normal everyday walk. We had just gotten off the car and began. We were walking on the trail for about 5 minutes or so, when I started feeling weird after a turn, neither scared nor afraid. I started to feel happy, as my little pain aches had disappeared. This was very strange, because I remember saying to myself, inside my head, not out loud, "Wow, I feel so good. I feel like a little kid, and brand new." It was only about 20 seconds of this young and joyful feeling when all of a sudden, something had let go of a large bush that was holding onto it. The thing sounded like it was intertwined in the bush, like holding on and trying to hide. At the same time of the noise, Bertha turned towards the bush and started going after it. I had her on a leash, and she was dragging me, almost taking me into the woods. I held to hold her back, because I couldn't see what was making all of that noise. It moved through another tall bush and started stepping heavily with loud thumps. I think it fell whenever it made out of the bush area. the thing was only about 15 feet away from us on the other side of the bushes, and sounded like two very large horses stomping on the ground. I could see the bushes and the grass moving, but I couldn't see anything. We moved back away from the trail a few feet, so that I could see a clearing on the other side of the bushes to try and see this thing. I looked right where the sound of the steps were coming from and saw nothing. So I looked down on the ground and I could see where 2 feet were stepping on the tall grass. I remember I said to myself in my head, "No way, that's not an invisible monster." After I said that, I heard something I will never forget. The thing started making a loud T-Rex sort of sound. Stomps. Then I say out loud, "That sounds like a T-Rex from the movies." I recall I could feel the stomps on the ground, and Bertha and I were just looking into the woods at the sound. I could feel my eardrums shaking badly. I said in my head, "It's trying to blow out my eardrums." The T-Rex stomp lasted about 10 to 15 seconds, and then just stopped, as if it had turned off. I have no idea if it jumped into something or it vanished. It is strange because after all of that I still felt so happy with no worry or fear at all. Just very curious. I really wanted to see it. On the way home I remember thinking, any other day, I would have been afraid and ran away from it. I heard this thing 3 or 4 more times in the following days, in another section of woods. I could hear someone heavily walking on the leaves just inside the tree line about 30 feet away in the woods alongside me and Bertha. I would hear it, and I would stop without turning to it, and it would take a step or two, and it would stop. I turned around a few times to see nothing, because I wasn't moving. I did this a few times to make sure. I would tell myself in my head, if a person stays on the trail, they have no permission to take you. I think one time I heard his footsteps in the woods next to me, and I said to myself in my head, I think it wants me to make a mistake and go into the woods towards it. After I said that, I never heard it again. I think it can hear what I'm thinking. Just a few weeks ago, I had seen something very strange related to this thing. Bertha and I were walking in the same part of the trail, only 100 feet away from my first encounter where the bushes were. I stopped to look into the woods, and I was standing, still looking past the trees, how the area was covered in a few inches of light green grass. I was looking kinda downhill, how the woods go down into the creek area, and I said to myself, it looks beautiful. The trees, the color of the greens, and the sunlight and the shadow. It looks like a postcard. About 2 or 3 seconds after that, while I was looking down at this area of pristine woodland, I saw a big human shape blur, move between trees about 80 feet away. I saw it for a fraction of a second. It was big, perhaps 10 feet tall judging by the trees, with a big head, big wide muscular shoulders, and his big left leg I remember seeing, as his left knee and big muscle were above it. Laterals. I could see how the thick, shiny hair on the leg was, and it looked exactly like the predator from the movie when he's cloaked. It's very weird how my brain was able to capture this image. My memory surprised even me. His shoulders and head and the side of his back were reflecting the woods between him and me. It looked male if I had to hazard a guess. I was surprised just like him. In my opinion, I think he took off running because he thought I was sensing he was in the area, but I had no idea he was there. I think he knows Bertha can't pick him up, so he hides a little further from the trail. I'm very cautious when I go hiking in those woods now. I also tell people where I'm going and carry a few extra things hidden on me. I have no idea why this thing got so close to me or what its intentions were, and I also don't know why it ran from me. Was there something behind it that startled it? These occurrences were a very incredible time in my life and changed me in a good way. I often think I don't know, but maybe that's why dogs are on this planet, to help us pick up on these things we don't see. Always be happy and do the things you love doing in your life. Have no worries and certainly no fear. I hope my story helps people be alert and careful to what's out there in the world. My friend told me this story a while ago, and at first I didn't believe him, but something about the way he said it and the look in his eyes and the tone of his voice still haunts me. He was on a date with his girlfriend at the time. This was in middle school, and they had just gotten some food and were walking around the neighborhood. They started to walk, and they approached this house that we called the Crazy House, because it had a bunch of garbage. When they looked up the street and saw this car stop while mid-right turn, as if they were stopping to let someone cross the street, but they didn't see anyone. Finally, they saw a man wave his hands towards the driver as to say thank you, and he was wearing a tall, black trench coat and an umbrella and a monocle. A second time was on the same day. They were walking around roughly the same place but on a court and on through the street. They turned the corner and saw him again at the end of the court. Mind you, there would have been no possible way for him to be there without them seeing it. There were only 2 entrances to the court, both in range of sight. I know this because he showed me the area the day after with a really freaked out look on his face. Now here's the scary part. The man walked up to them and walked past them, stopped, closed his umbrella, turned around and stared at them in the eyes and walked away. They've both seen him after that in different towns and different homes. They've seen him playing cards on the ground with his face on it, and so forth. Then again, I don't completely believe him, but there were 2 people present at the time, and both are super sensitive about the topic. Plus, the way he tells it is like Aware Storytime 10. His eyes get super wide and freaked out. His heart rate goes all up. And we refer to him as that one dude with the black umbrella. I don't really know what it could have been. I'm open to hearing anyone's possible explanations. A few years ago, I experienced a strange incident that continues to baffle me. It occurred one night when I was abruptly awoken from my slumber by an urgent need to use the bathroom. As I opened my eyes, they stung from the glare of the TV that I habitually left on while falling asleep. I have a peculiar habit of listening to horror stories as I drift off, which I suppose isn't ideal for a restful night's sleep. Reluctantly, I mustered the resolve to get out of bed, even though the cold of the winter made it especially unappealing. It was in the middle of the year, during South Africa's winter season. I begrudgingly made my way to the small bathroom adjoining my room, quickly attending to my needs. As I turned my head towards the window, situated across the room from the bathroom, I noticed a slight gap between the curtains. Through that opening, illuminated by the glow of my TV, I focused my gaze on my neighbor's roof. To my astonishment, I spotted a figure that resembled a gargoyle complete with wings. At first, I convinced myself that my eyes were playing tricks on me, but to my horror, the figure actually moved. Grateful for the fact that I was still seated on the toilet, I managed to avoid an embarrassing incident. Eventually, curiosity overcame my fear, and I summoned the courage to investigate further. Approaching the window cautiously, I strained to get a closer look at the mysterious creature. Just as I reached the window, it abruptly turned to face my neighbor's backyard. From my vantage point, I could discern its profile. Glowing red or orange eyes. The darkness of the night made it difficult to see other details in full, but I could make out what seemed to be dark, possibly scaly skin, though I hesitate to classify it as skin, given the strange nature of the creature. In an instant, the creature spread its wings, which appeared remarkably large, and vanished from sight, as if it had vanished in the blink of an eye. The thought of this colossal entity prowling around my house with my pets outdoors set my heart plummeting into my stomach. Filled with apprehension, I diligently searched for my animals, eventually finding them and bringing them safely inside. Finally, I closed all the windows and attempted to go back to sleep, although my mind was plagued with unease. I never encountered the creature or anything similar again, gradually forgetting about the incident as time passed. Yet I remained perplexed as to what I witnessed that night. I find myself seeking help and advice, concerned that perhaps I'm losing my sanity, and confident this was no dream, as the pain I felt when my cat accidentally scratched me in her startled state was too real. If anyone can offer any insight or guidance regarding what I saw, I would deeply appreciate it. Almost every day, my friend and I used to walk in the woods by his place. When walking, we'd hear the sound of footsteps alongside us, behind us, ahead of us, and all around us. It sounded like people walking in the woods. If we stopped walking, the sound of steps would stop. If one of us walked and the other one stood still, there were no sounds of footsteps. We both had to walk. This went on for years. We'd stand still and look everywhere and see nothing but trees. Take a few steps and we'd immediately hear people walking around us. One day we were walking down the road instead of the woods, and we heard the same noise of footsteps from the woods. We looked into the woods and there was a tiny little bird. It was hopping in the leaves at exactly human walking pace. 2 years of worrying for a 4-inch tall hopping bird. They didn't live in my woods, but they were all over the wood. It was nice to solve a problem with a relatively happy ending. I lived in Nevada with my wife, in a newly constructed house that was 3 floors. The master bedroom was on the 3rd floor, and there were no doors up to the master floor. It was just open, like a loft, but it was a full-sized area, not a converted attic or anything. This is pretty common in Nevada so that they can squeeze in as many thin, taller houses as possible. One night about a month ago, into moving into the house, we're both asleep. I wake up in the middle of the night around 2ish and see all the way to the other side of the room a little creature, all black. I couldn't make out any features or eyes or anything, but it was small, maybe 2 feet tall, with 2 arms and legs like a person, but was wider and didn't move like a person. It was unnaturally fast. It ran quickly to the edge of the bed, and I could tell it was looking right at me. It could move. I could move. And I was very conscious in remembering, I don't have time for this. I remember it peered over the mattress, and it had a longer nose, but for some reason, it was not able or allowed to get onto the bed. I watched it for about 10 seconds and then thought, okay, if I can't get up, I'm just going to roll over. So I rolled over and nothing else happened that night. I know it's pretty anticlimactic, but that's what happened, and I never saw anything in the house again. I was definitely awake, and I could move, so it wasn't sleep paralysis. I've had that once, and that's much worse and terrifying. I'm just wondering if anyone has seen anything like it, if there's a name to it. I'd just like more information. This happened in around 1996, when I was 8 years old. It was getting dark out, but the sky wasn't totally black, like a deep blue. You could make out the clouds fairly easily, and there weren't many stars yet. We had a large sunroom, with lots of big windows, and I was sitting on the floor playing with Lego. Occasionally, I'd get up and walk around or just move around, because little kids can't sit still and don't keep their attention very well. I had gotten up for a 3rd or 4th time when something outside caught my attention. It was up in the sky, but like I said earlier, it wasn't dark out yet. I could make out a shape, like a large triangle with rounded sides. It wasn't moving very quickly, and didn't seem to be making any noise, other than a faint glow and low rumbling. It was more of a sensation than anything. There were pink lights at the 3 corners that were flickering in a sequence, left, top, right, top, left, right. There was one light in the middle that faded out slowly, and was very, very bright white. It would seem pretty odd for a plane to have lights like that, or for one to be shaped like this. I watched for a good 10 to 15 seconds before it completely vanished. It didn't fly away or move or anything. It was like hiding a layer in Photoshop, just completely gone. I had ran and told my mother, and I don't know if she was humoring me or actually believed me, but she came out and looked up into the sky with me, and of course, there was nothing there. Other than a few stories like this from when I was younger, I hadn't seen anything notable in the skies recently. I'd like to share something that happened to me when I was 9 years old, and remember really well even now that I'm 36. It bothers me that I have not been able to find a proper explanation, and I'm asking for your help. I was on holiday with my family at Gabice, a fairly known place on the Adriatic coast of Italy. As I'm mentioning it, because there are several weird legends surrounding the region, like the Valbrunas town, which is known as the Italian Atlantis, since it apparently submerged by the sea for unknown reasons during Roman times, and fishers and locals claim to have found remnants of columns, temples, and other proof of it, as well as an ancient temple dedicated to Zeus, which was located on the St. Bartolo Mount, which is located just nearby, or miraculous sightings of the Virgin Mary. It's quite an eerie place, because mountains and sea and towns are all just merged together. I was taking a stroll with my father where there are many people surrounding us because it was June and the streets near the seaside were crowded, when I suddenly saw something really weird lying on the pavement. It was an animal's leg, a reptile's apparently, which had been cut off, but instead of dripping blood it oozed a clear slimy fluid. It was dark green, almost black in colour, covered in scales with little lighter underneath, with 3 slender digits, the middle one longer than the others, and every digit spotted a curved claw like a hen's foot. Of course, I got really spooked off and instantly tried grabbing my father's attention about my discovery, but he looked really annoyed at me, claiming there was nothing on the pavement. I'm absolutely sure he wasn't lying, because at the same time, I was also really sure about what I saw. No one else seemed to notice this horrible thing, so I just walked away. When I got back a few hours later, of course, there was nothing. And as I got older, I did research and found some similarities with taselworm's leg. But since the creature is legendary and apparently doesn't really exist, I was more oriented to believing that it could have been an abnormally big slowworm or lizard's leg, except those usually have 4 digits instead of 3 and don't sport any sort of clothes. I mean, if it was a cryptid's leg, though other people should have seen it, right? I'm honestly at a loss at what exactly this was and how it was there, and how my father didn't see it. Any advice would be really appreciated regarding this phantom limb. My boyfriend and I were camping alone in the mountains of Colorado in early June. There was still snow covering the top of the mountain where we were, and there was little to no nature around. I woke up in the middle of the night to something lifting me and the corner of the tent. Freaked out, I quickly awoke my boyfriend with this strong urge to get out and shoot whatever was lifting the tent. He refused to let me do so. He yelled at it and it stopped, but later that night it happened again. But we slept through it. When morning came, we saw there were no handprints in the snow or any trace of an animal. I'd love your thoughts on what the hell could have been lifting my tent without leaving any prints. When I was 10 and my sister 8, we were planning on sleeping out on a 2nd-story balcony one summer night, and we were out there on our sleeping bags. It was around 7 or 8 at night, so not dark yet, when suddenly all of the neighborhood sounds like cars, dogs, people, birds, etc. went totally silent for about 30 seconds. We noticed and was like, well, that was weird. We even both mentioned having a creepy sensation befall us, but we stayed out there anyway. About 2 to 3 minutes later, a rounded triangular something that was about the size of a dinner table essentially dropped into the area about 10 feet directly above us. I'm not saying it was a UFO, but it looked for all the world like a UFO. It was metallic, and there were lights and windows. It hovered for a few seconds and then zipped up and away. We freaked out and ran inside. This was in the 90s, so if it was a drone, this was way ahead of its time.